Alright, good morning everybody. Welcome to the council meeting on the 21st of October. Welcome you all here, and ask for apologies. I don't believe there are any that will come my way. Any leave of absence required in this? No. Any conflicts of interest in regards to this agenda? I think there is no public forum. There are no extraordinary or urgent items. There is a confirmation of council minutes for the meeting held on the 29th of September. I'm happy to move those minutes as a true and correct record. Is there a seconder? Councillor Menzies. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. We go straight into the business of the day, starting with 7.1, and just note that 7.1 and 7 through to 7.4 are the matters that need to go out for public consultation. So we'll just go through these. We'll find the appropriate person in attendance to speak to them. The first one is the draft significance and engagement policy. Thank you.
Morena, Your Worship and Councillors. The purpose of this report is to present the draft significance and engagement policy to Council to endorse for public consultation. I'd like to take the report as read and hone in on the feedback received from the Community and Strategy Committee regarding the draft policy. As you recall, the policy requires that Council list what it considers to be its strategic assets, and much of the feedback from the committee centred around that. Before getting into that detail, I would like to emphasise that the list of strategic assets forms a minor part of this policy. The core of this policy is to provide guidance on how Council assesses significance on a case-by-case basis, then what it does with that, so meaning the engagement with the community in dealing with those issues. So related to this point, listing an asset as strategic is not determinative of how the asset will be treated with respect to significance and engagement. As you'll recall, the main effect of being a strategic asset is that a proposal to change ownership or control of an asset as a whole needs to be done through the LTP framework. There are advantages and disadvantages to this. It ensures that a community engagement occurs through the context of the LTP, so the big picture stuff, and it also means that there could be a delay in there could be a delay in additional costs in order to align the decision making with the LTP process. So as you will see, there's 8 tables in the report that consider assets that may or may not, at Council's discretion, be considered strategic. So the purpose of the information is to provide Council with details to make that decision. So I'm going to emphasise a key point for each table before turning to discussion. So with the table 1, the roading and bridge network, there was agreement from the committee of the importance of this asset to the district. With the Around the Mountain Cycle Trail, this was added as a result of discussion by the committee. The Three Waters assets, whilst there will be a change in this space in terms of service delivery, it doesn't change the importance of this asset. With Parks and Reserve, a place on the strategic asset list confirms the importance of these to district well-being. And CISA on there illustrates the provision of electricity as a vital service to Rakiura. So community housing is not required by the LGA to be on this list. Staff recommendation is to not list this asset as strategic, as the implications of doing so may not provide for the best management of this asset. Similarly with Tiano Airport, it is not required by the LGA to be listed, and so as with community housing, staff recommendation is to not list this asset as the implications of doing so may not provide for the best management. Jetties were discussed at the committee, and they are not currently listed as strategic in the policy, and it is not staff recommendation to do so, primarily due to this leading to inconsistent identification of assets within the water facilities activity, but also for the reasons identified with community housing and the TNO airport. So I'll reiterate that the purpose of these tables is to give council guidance. There is a preferred recommendation of the list at Rec D, but it is council's discretion to make this decision. You'll see that the preferred option as a whole is to endorse the draft policy for consultation, but the alternatives are discussed in the options sections. Next steps are that if council endorses the policy for consultation, it will go out alongside 3 other policies from the 4th of November to 4th of December. Staff will present the submissions in early 2021, which will be followed by the deliberations and adoption. So, following on the recommendation of the report, Your Worship, would it be acceptable to focus on the tables, in order of the tables, and resolve discussion in that manner, and then turn to general questions around the policy?
Yeah. No problem.
Right, happy to turn to that table 1 regarding roading and bridge. If there's any feedback on that.
So is there any feedback in relation to this item? I know it could get it quite ahead, Councillor Owen.
Yeah, I wonder if there's a bit of ambiguity around the reference to as a whole. Does that sort of lead someone reading it to, would they be led to believe that only if the assets were being sold off as a whole or as a collective that would trigger?
So, through Your Worship, the word is really intentional to mean exactly that, is that dealing with individual components of the asset is not required to be run through the LTP process. It is only if council were considering a change of ownership or control of the asset as an entirety, and so that's very deliberate that word is there.
So it would only ever be dealt with as a whole. Councillor Harper.
Yes, through you, Your Worship. The parks and reserves, is there any way of tiering them? Some are definitely strategic assets and are well used by the local people. Others are way out in the back blocks and will probably never be used just by the local people. Many of them have been grazed out for probably as long as I can remember, and they probably will never be used as a facility for the town that they're involved in. So I'm just wondering if some of them, if they could be tiered some way so that some are strategic and some are sort of something else.
Through you, Your Worship, I think it carries on from the discussion we've just had as a whole. This is across the whole spectrum of all of them as a whole item, rather than separating them out into different layers. In the way they're managed and everything like that, that already happens. But for this document, it's about whether it's a strategic asset as a whole rather than individual ones.
So, in that case, Louise, if we've already indicated to council here or through Mr McNaught that some of these assets could be sold off. So if they're all combined in as a strategic asset, you won't be able to sell one piece off against the other without going through the long-term plan, which could be...
Through you, Your Worship, no, you will be able to, because you wouldn't be able to sell the whole, all of them off as one item under this process, but because we're specifying them as a whole, you can still do individual ones.
Yeah, through the LTP.
During the... No, you can do it at any time.
Yep, thank you.
So we need to put that in table 4 as a whole, because it's not in there at the moment under that recommendation D. It's portfolio.
It's just a recommendation. It is in the through Your Worship. It is in the table, but it's just not in the recommendation.
Yeah. So do we
It's
need
not
to
in the
put?
draft.
Do we need that in the recommendation?
Is it not in the draft policy? Yeah.
clear on that one. Do we need it under D, portfolio of district reserves, parks and reserves as a whole? Does that need, those words need to be there?
Yes.
My apologies for that permission.
No, that's okay. This is the time now to clarify that. Councillor Owen, did you have?
No, it's just following on.
Sorry, Councillor Douglas.
Yes, I was just following on from Councillor Harper. You know, like we have our staff to identify surplus assets, and it's important we retain that flexibility to allow us to sell those, and under this policy we can. Say it was a park, you know, a park, as Councillor Harper said, in the back blocks never used, because we're only selling a small part and not the whole, it wouldn't trigger the need to be included in the LTP as we want to sell it. We could do it without full notification. Is that?
Through your worship, yes.
Yeah.
So dealing with components of the asset does not trigger the LTP process requirements. It will trigger the necessity to assess the asset using this policy
Yes.
and determine its significance individually, but not the LTP requirement.
And Councillor Douglas, that would apply to a bridge as well, if there was a bridge we were going to pass on. Yeah. Sorry, Councillor Scott.
Thanks, Your Worship. Just for clarification on table, table 2 for the cycle trail. So when you're talking about ownership or control of the network as a whole, does that mitigate any of this sort of new work that's getting done around a trust to govern it? So that sort of transfer and control potentially?
Through you, Your Worship, my understanding is that what's being contemplated is not relinquishing control of the asset as a whole. The council will very much still be in control of the vast majority, and so what's being considered as a division of that. So we could get really semantic in a discussion of what you consider control, but my interpretation at the moment is that in no way, shape, or form is council considering, you know, saying we don't want anything to do with this anymore.
Yeah, just I was a bit confused with that as a whole, because if you're transferring a part of that control, that still fits within.
That's
so that,
legitimate, yes.
Yeah. Cool, thank you.
Councillor Kramer.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I just want to make some comment with regards to table 7, the Chandler Airport Manapuru. I know that currently it is a strategic asset and it is recommended that it will be removed from the strategic asset register. I have some concerns about that reclassification. When you consider what's happening with the Milford Opportunities project and how they're looking at possible options for the future for that airport, it seems to be in conflict of what we're looking at from a strategic perspective for the entire district. Great South have also identified that it sees the airport as a strategic part of Southern District. The Fiordland Community Board have also indicated that they see it as a strategic asset for that particular area. The emergency management have also signalled that there is a strategic asset there for those sort of events. So it seems to me that the staff's recommendation may not have taken into consideration the proposed reclassification and what the implications of that could be. So I have some concerns about that. If it's all to do with how the asset is managed, I'm sure that the asset can be managed under a classification of being a strategic asset. It doesn't have to be changed. The other concern is that there's some real opportunities to be had in the future with that particular airport. I know that we've struggled in the past, and I think there are certain aspects to that airport that prevented any potential development based on the agreements that were in place at that time, and they were appropriate at that time. And that particular agreement has lapsed, and it's now provided an opportunity for the district to look at that asset and how it can develop it even further. And there is interest in the airport for future development. So I think it's imperative that we continue to have the classification that it is a strategic asset for this district. I think it's important. Other organisations see it as important as a district asset, and I think we need to be going out during our consultation in support of that and not in competition to it. Or, as I say, it's important that we provide strong leadership and recognise that it is a strategic asset and it should be reflected in this consultation document. So I would urge that we continue with the classification of a strategic asset for the airport and do not go out in consultation indicating that it is not.
Thank you, Councillor Kramer. And although it's not required in the Local Government Act, I'm hearing what Councillor Kramer is saying. So this is the time now to put that on the list, isn't it? Today?
Yeah, today.
Yeah.
When we get to
So when we deal with that recommendation, we raise that point, Councillor Kramer. But I would say, Councillor Byers, would you?
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. Well, I'd like to support the staff recommendation here, Councillor Kramer. It's great that Great South and Milford Opportunities and the Community Board are looking at ways of utilising that asset in TR now, but we have to be realistic and appreciate that it's costing ratepayers money at the moment. It's a hole. It's burning a hole in ratepayers' pockets. So by removing it as a strategic asset isn't taking the airport away. It's still there. So if there's some good ideas and ways to develop it, then great. But at least it creates opportunities for the ratepayers to deal with it.
We probably shouldn't get into debate here. This is we either put it in or we don't. And that consultation process takes.
I would support the staff recommendation there to remove that as a strategic asset.
Thank you, Councillor Harper.
Yes, Your Worship. So I'd just like to follow on from Councillor Kramer's remarks. We see in the papers how the Auckland-Invercargill run is getting bigger and bigger. Putting on another jet over Christmas time. Whilst the law would like everybody to pop out of the jet at Invercargill and drive up the Southern Scenic Route south and then back to Tiana, some may not have the time and wish to fly from Invercargill to Manapori Airstrip. They have Stewart Island Air Services sitting there. I'm quite sure they could accommodate things like that. So I think it is pretty important that it remains to the region and as a strategic asset.
Thank you. Councillor Duff.
Thank you. It's not something that's spent a lot of time thinking about in advance, but I certainly see the sense in what Councillor Kramer was saying and Councillor Harper. And I think given the connection with Milford and the fact that we're in a whole new scene now with tourism and how it may play out, I believe that perhaps the faith that we've held in that airport over this whole length of time might be about to come to fruition. And I think it would be bad timing right at the moment to change that classification.
Councillor Douglas.
Yeah, and I would support that view. To me, the Tiana Airport is an underutilised asset. We have got expressions of interest around ways of developing it. I think that we need to set up a separate organisation, whether it be a trust or whatever, that focuses in on developing a business case so that we explore all opportunities around getting the best value out of the Tiana Airport, and we certainly haven't been doing that in recent years.
Great.
So would that be easier to achieve if it was retained as a strategic asset or made a strategic asset or not? But either way, I think it would be simple to do that if it was a strategic asset, and it gives certainty of ownership. It signifies to our ratepayers that we think this airport is worthy of further development and work.
Thank you, councillors, and yeah, it'll all come out in the wash on the 4th of December when we discuss it. But, yeah, Councillor.
Yeah, just to follow up on some of those comments, particularly through Councillor Douglas, that the Fuel and Community Board has been frustrated, I suppose would be the word, with regards to being able to develop that particular airport. And as I indicated before, there were certain agreements in place that actually prevented some progress in that sort of development. There's been significant interest in the airport by private individuals as to how they could utilise that airport a lot better. So the Community Board, having had that governance role in the past, have never shirked away from that. but it has been difficult, as I say, because of the agreements that were in place previously. So now there is an opportunity to progress that, and that board is certainly very keen to progress it. We've had numerous reports on the possibilities of utilisation of that report, but as I say, there were certain restrictions that were out of our control to be able to progress those. So there are opportunities, and that's why I think it's important when we go out there during our consultation, we send the right signal. And I don't think we're providing that right signal in the consultation document.
Yep, totally get that picture, but we're still not in that debate process
That's all just
around it. Yeah, no, that's
yeah.
fine. So there's still, if there's no other comments around that, we've still got a fair bit to do in the report, haven't we?
Well, Your Worship, I'm happy to swing back to the assets not covered, but we need to reach a determination
On this.
the list as a whole.
Yeah. So Councillor Owen, did you?
Yeah, just regarding community housing as a whole, I think it's a bit too preemptive. Council hasn't yet had a decision on a direction in this space, and I think that it would be reasonable to the community that if we were to change our approach with regards to community housing, that it should be signalled in an LTP or a special consultative process. So I think that should be included as a strategic asset. It may not be Council's core business, but it certainly strategically has big influences on the full well-beings of our communities, and I think that we need to have it included in there as a strategic asset.
So we're hearing in relation to D that the airport and community housing stay as a strategic asset, and let the consultation process decide post the 4th of December. That's the nodding I'm seeing around the room.
Yep.
So, Councillor Harper.
And just another quick question for Kerry. You're going out for consultation between the 4th of November, 4th of December. Do all community boards meet in that month, within that month, with the opportunity to discuss all this?
Through Your Worship, they start tonight, and we'll be getting a report that presents the policies going up for presentation or for consultation, and the opportunity to discuss it should they wish, and be encouraged to make a submission.
That's my understanding, Councillor Harper, that all community boards will have access to this prior to the prior to enduring.
We've got one meeting on the 4th of November, and that's it.
Yeah.
Can I, through you, Your Worship, reference and I suppose request councillors also ensure wider communication with the wider community to have input into providing feedback on these policies as well. It's broader than just community boards input, and the public consultation process is about the public. So I just encourage you as advocates and representatives on behalf of your community to ensure A, that the public is aware, and B, if there is interest in the public to input, that the consultation process is their chance to do so, and not just rely on community boards. It's not saying community boards aren't effective, but it's actually, it's more important to get that wider public and wider community perspective through the consultation process as well.
Absolutely, Mr. Cable. It's not elected members only, this is everybody.
Yes.
Yeah, that's right. Councillor Owen and Councillor Kramer.
Thank you. Just further on to that point, I think that this is potentially the right place to formalise Council's direction on how we want community boards to have the opportunity to have influence over particularly district-funded activities, and to set the expectations levels right in terms of when and how Council will be going back to community boards on those things, because traditionally it doesn't seem to have been done well with regards to district-funded activities. And I think this is the place that we should be having a conversation with our community boards and getting some collective agreement from them to come back and tell us what their expectations and wishes are, and come to some agreement there.
On behalf of their communities.
I think it's going to be the foundation for building that strong ongoing relationship to have it at a basic level.
Okay, thank you. All right, if there's no other questions or comments around D, my feeling is that there's going to be a recommendation to D that we include the Te Anau Airport and community housing and strategic assets, and let the consultation process establish how we're going to deal with that. So do we need to include that now?
Well, we need to get a mover and second before
Yeah.
we report all the recommendations and then can allow for any amendments.
Okay. So are there any further? Sorry,
Councillor Menzies.
Councillor Menzies.
Thank you, Your Worship. It's just a note really when this is going out for further discussion with the community boards and the community. Just noting that we had difficulty understanding the words as a whole and recommend that that's clearly set out in the information. Although I did understand it when you sent it out to us, but it does raise questions for people. So thank you for that.
Through Your Worship, we can ensure that that information is relayed when the report about the policy is presented to CBs. Yeah.
Thank you. Is there any further matters you want to put on the report before I start looking at the recommendations? Okay, Councillor Cramer.
Just a point of clarification, Your Worship. So the tables will be amended to reflect the new recommendations to ensure that they are strategic assets. So your staff recommendations will change.
Through Your Worship, the tables will be going out as part of the consultation document. There will be a list in the draft policy of what Council considers its strategic assets, and we can invite feedback on that list. But this table was for the purposes of Council to be armed with information to make the decision today.
Yeah, appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, so the recommendations you have in regards to 7.1 A, B and C are the normal recommendations. Then we've got D, which is the following strategic assets to be listed in the draft significance and engagement policy, the one that goes out to public, and that is to include the one that's up on the wall here, and that will include the Te Anau Airport as a whole and community housing as a whole. And then we look at E, that we endorse either one or two. Well, personally, I believe we need to go out for consultation. There's no other way forward. Te Anau Airport as a whole and community housing as a whole.
Yes. It should be referred to as the Te Anau Airport, Your Worship.
Yeah, I was just going to ask if there's any amendments to that. Those descriptions are Southern District Council Community Housing, so it's community housing as a whole, and the Te Anau Airport as a whole. Oh no, that doesn't need that. Sorry. No, that's
We need to make sure we don't ever miss out the W in whole.
Believe me, I nearly did this.
Shovel it.
So we'll tidy that up later, but that is the intent of D. Everyone agree with that wording? And then we endorse either one or two in E. So is there a councillor in a position to move A through to E? One. Councillor Cramer, seconded Councillor Duffy. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Look forward to the consultation process. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is on page 45, and it's the development and financial contributions. Again, consultation, 7.2.
So at the risk of sounding repetitive, the purpose of this report is to present the draft policy on development and financial contributions for Council to endorse for consultation. So the draft policy is consistent with the current policy, and it puts the collection of development contributions in remission on the basis that Council wants to encourage growth. The financial contributions part of the policy is operative. As outlined in the report, the schedules in the draft policy, so that's at page 105 of the agenda, outline the projects being undertaken in the draft LTP 2021-31 that have a demand-related component. So the purpose of Rec F is to provide a delegation to the CE to approve any potential updates to these schedules prior to the draft policy being released for public consultation on the 4th of November. If Council approves this draft policy for consultation, formal consultation will occur alongside the 3 other draft policies. And you'll see that the preferred option is to endorse the draft policy for consultation, but the alternative is discussed in the options section. I'm happy to answer any questions before turning to the recommendations.
Thank you. Are there any questions in relation to this draft policy? If not, I'll ask for a move that we move the recommendations A through to F as per the agenda. It's moved by Councillor Douglas, seconded by Councillor Ruddingclaw. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is 7.3, which is the procurement policy, which again is for consultation. Robin.
Good morning, Your Worship and Councillors. I may just have Ashby Brown pop in to join me any time now, hopefully. This report presents a draft procurement policy for Council to consider, and it recommends Council endorse the draft policy for public consultation. So the draft policy would apply when goods, services and assets are actively being sought from a supplier. The current procurement policy was adopted in 2010 and is due for review. The draft policy outlines a set of high-level procurement policy objectives and includes policy statements on how Council would achieve those objectives. The draft policy differs from the current policy as it only contains high-level policy information, not the operational steps that staff must take to procure. Changes have also been made so the draft policy aligns with the new government procurement rules that came into effect in 2019. Councils are currently encouraged to follow these rules, but they are not mandatory. Staff have been developing a procurement manual that will include practical steps that staff will have to go through to procure. The manual will implement the policy approach outlined in the final procurement policy. Staff presented and discussed the draft policy with the Finance and Assurance Committee on 11 September. This report outlines the feedback received from the committee. 2 aspects that the committee commented on were how staff would implement achieving public value and how the policy would be monitored and reviewed. Staff have addressed these points in the report. The committee also recommended that Council release the draft policy for public consultation. It is proposed that this policy will also be consulted on from 4 November to 4 December 2020. There's been one development in the procurement space since this report was included on the agenda for this meeting. On 14 October, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment opened a period of public consultation inviting feedback to extend the government procurement rules so they are compulsory to Council. I haven't undertaken a thorough analysis at this stage, but if these rules did become mandatory for Council, staff may have to amend the proposed policy and the manual that's being developed. No timeframe has been formally indicated for when these changes might be made, and sentiment in the sector is that these changes will require a substantial transition. On this basis, staff believe it's appropriate to proceed towards adopting a new policy and to amend the policy at a later date if need be. This report recommends Council endorse and release the draft policy for public consultation, and the recommendations for this report are on page 120 of the agenda. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have, and maybe Matt might be able to assist if there's procurement questions that I can't answer.
Thank you. I know this was fairly well discussed at a finance meeting, so more than happy with that. And I agree that we can't wait around. We've got to have business as usual in Council, so we need to proceed with this matter. Are there any comments or questions? Councillor Menzies.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just in relation to paragraph 37, you've noted only a small amount of positive feedback has been received from suppliers to date. Are you meaning there that all the feedback that has been received is positive to date as to only a small amount?
Through Your Worship, yes, we only received a small amount, and everything we did receive positive.
And the other question I have is really around the use of the word appropriate. So, for example, under it's at page 130. The standard procurement methods outlined in the procurement manual will be followed. Any deviation from the standard procedures methods will be appropriately authorised. So we're understanding that there are robust systems behind this that for authorisation, other than just, so I feel appropriate doesn't really add a lot to the sentence in terms of my understanding. It's used frequently through that section.
Sorry for you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to say there's two aspects to it. One is the delegations,
yeah,
and then there'll be other, which is a separate policy and document, and the other aspect is the authorisations contained within the manual itself. So that's, I think, what it means by is appropriate.
Yes, so it's just that assurance, because there's a following appropriate procurement policies. I'd just read following procurement policies as opposed to appropriate, and that it doesn't add a lot to it. And just on page 130, under the table there, I presume under economic, that's market stroke supplier, is it? Under that table.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Councillor Owen.
Just with regards to how a potential supplier would use this document in terms of, if I was doing this, I would look straight to what is the public value, to like what's the definition of that, and so I think that table is really important, but I think we've missed some key things that that certainly council's purchasing does have an influence over. So, for example, there's nothing here indicating a preference for local suppliers or any in terms of whether the things are sourced locally, be it wool from, for carpets, being wool carpets, supporting the New Zealand industry. So that's something that's missing from the economic, or in terms of if the business is New Zealand owned or Southland owned versus internationally or nationally owned, and I think that's important that we should clarify, because people who are local should be putting that information forward, because I think it should give them extra weighting because of that whole multiplier effect in the economy. That's one of those broader for wellbeing outcomes. Another thing is that in regards to good price and considering the costs across the whole of life, I think that should also include energy costs across the whole of life. Various options that you look towards for capital purchases will have various levels of energy efficiency, and we should be asking suppliers around that ongoing operating costs of not only the equipment and supplies but the energy consumed. And potentially could go further than that as well, depending on the Zero Carbon Act, as what the emissions of that equipment is as well, should also be asked for. If we don't put it in here, people won't provide it. So
through your worship, as you'll be aware, we've also got a manual that's going to sit with this procurement policy, and things like local suppliers and energy efficiency have been very much on our radar. And so at the moment our intention is to have a form that staff will complete, and when they're setting their evaluation criteria, which is how they're going to look at what they're going to award the contract based on, we've got prompters of things like local suppliers and all these sort of sustainability and environmental type components that will be considered as they sort out their prioritisation list. But maybe what we could do in relation to this table is give a few more examples.
I think so, because if those suppliers don't know that you're looking for those things, because I'm assuming they're not going to see this form that you're assessing them on, then they're not going to think to include them necessarily. So we need to look at this table as their prompt for telling what information we want them to come forward with.
So, through your worship, we're happy to give a couple more examples to highlight those aspects in the table if the council considers it appropriate. I don't know if you wanted to, in terms of what suppliers would see when we're requesting information from them, could you speak to that aspect of so they would be aware of what we would be looking for when we are seeking?
I think the manual contemplates, and it's still in draft stage, we're making some tweaks to it, but it contemplates several different levels of complexity and cost, so they would see some of that information as appropriate to the level of complexity of what you're procuring. So in some, for minor procurement, they wouldn't necessarily see that, but some of those, the form that was mentioned, that would trigger a more comprehensive, say, RFT document that goes out, or even at a higher level, a procurement plan. So one is the internal forms that the staff complete, and to go through the procurement process, and the output from that is the document that goes to market, whether that's a RF, whatever that process is. They're two separate processes.
Mr. Russell might want to speak.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you, I was just going to comment in relation to Councillor Owen's comments. Any procurement process that we head to market with has an RFP or an RFQ or an RFT, and that document is the place that any potential submitter will gain the visibility around what evaluation and criteria any particular procurement exercise is being assessed against. So all of that is very transparent and very clear to any potential submitter in any procurement exercise we undertake. That's and very much implicit and required as part of our policy and manual process. But certainly happy to as Robin indicated, expand on those examples.
I've just been involved in tender selection processes where people haven't put forward particular information that would have weighted them higher because they didn't realise that that was considered a public value, would have been considered a public value aspect to their business. So I think we owe it to them, if we want really good outcomes, to be as upfront with that information on this particular table as possible.
Thank you. So we've got Councillor Byers, Duffy and Kramer. Councillor Byers.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm just supporting Councillor Owen. I note in the Local Government Act that the local authority should use its resources in the interests of its district. So it's pretty clear there that there should be some sort of emphasis on using the resources back into the region which is supporting it. And really I don't see any mention of that in this document here. So I wonder if perhaps there's a way, because I understand other councils around the country are being fairly specific in trying to direct the funds back to the district.
So Your Worship, again, might be appropriate to add that as an example in the public value table, but we do have to be reasonably careful in the policy because there are examples where we might procure where, I don't know, you probably speak to this more accurately than I do, but where local suppliers wouldn't be a relevant criteria. Is that there may be examples of that?
Certainly there would be examples, but I think what you're saying, everything else held equal,
yeah.
we would want to prioritise local suppliers as long as everything else is held equal. There may be examples where there may not be a local supplier.
Well, if there's no local supplier, then fine. But even holding equal, I think we're suggesting that if it's a local supplier, then we'd like to see the table tilted, a real acknowledgement of supporting the local people. So it's not even a balance.
Which is a national message to support local. So,
I mean,
so I'm picking up that the council's under economic, obviously change that market, maybe put local market or supplier. And I see in the good price, but it's the whole life, not wildlife. Yeah. So that was 2 amendments. So Councillor, have you that? Councillor Duffy.
Thank you, Your Worship. I was just going to really make a comment following on from Councillor Owen's points and the, while our internal processes might be taking care of those aspects, like to do with the energy and carbon, etc. I think having it in a policy shows that we're prepared to show leadership in that sort of area. So,
Councillor Kramer.
Councillor Duffy's covered the point there, so providing that leadership.
Very good.
Through Your Worship. Sounds great. Thank you for the clarity on that, so we can include those changes.
No, that's cool. Any other comments or questions around this matter? If not, you have the recommendation in front of you under 7.3, A, B and C as read, and then A, that should be D, sorry. D, endorse the following options. Is there a councillor? Councillor Byler.
Sorry, Your Worship. So we've established that there's going to be some changes to this document. So
To this document.
What are we going to do in here?
Oh yeah, because it hasn't got the one about changes by the CE as appropriate, is it?
No.
Can we include that in the changes made as per that last recommendation that the Chief Executive can make those changes? Or do you want to actually
well, I'm
indicate the
thinking
changes?
about this direction, you know, the focus on local or supporting the district suppliers.
Through Your Worship,
If you wish
add
to-
a recommendation E, requesting that staff include in the public value table specific mention of local suppliers and considering energy costs and energy efficiency of suppliers.
Councillor Byers, I'm looking at you. Are you happy with that?
Actually, D can just have that added to the end of it.
And it's going to consultation.
So we'll just wait for Fiona to catch up here, but yeah, D could be that option 1 endorses the release of the draft procurement policy for consultation in accordance, blah, 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 and
With the additional, what was the thing, Robin?
With an amendment to the table on public value, adding that local suppliers and energy costs and energy efficiency.
Yeah, local suppliers and energy
costs and energy efficiency
efficiencies
will be added to that table.
and to be the new E, which is delegates authority to the Chief Executive to approve minor amendments to the schedules in the draft policy before commencement of the public consultation period.
No schedules.
Yeah, no schedules, yeah. Approve minor amendments.
To the draft policy.
Yeah, to the draft.
to the draft policy.
No. You can put it with us.
Okay, so we've got I believe we've got agreement to change that item, D, to include.
It says A.
Yeah, well, it's getting changed to D.
Change D. The table for public value to include local suppliers and energy efficiency to be added, and that any minor amendments be delegated to the Chief Executive.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're happy to move that? Councillor Owen has moved that. Is there a seconder? Councillor Scott, all those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thank you for that discussion on that matter. Next item on the agenda is page 149, is the draft revenue and financing policy and rating review. Again, that needs to go out for public consultation. And this was discussed last night at Finance and Assurance Committee. And there were some amendments made to this, which will be outlined, I am guessing, very soon.
Thank you, Bishop. Just in terms of the structure today, I just thought we would just recap the process we've been through just through a PowerPoint so that we can just kind of remind ourselves about where we've been to where we've got to. So I was going to talk through that, and in the process of talking to that PowerPoint, we'll talk about some of the issues that are in the paper, and we'll be given an opportunity to discuss those and get direction from that. And at the conclusion of that, we can then come back to the report proper and the policy proper and just check if there's any feedback that you have or any changes that you would like in regards to that. So if we're comfortable with that, I'll pick into it. As we know now, I can talk for a bit. Okay. So what we're doing today is endorsing the draft review and financing policy for that to go to consultation. And I just wanted to put into context what role does this policy play for council? So it sits underneath the financial strategy. So the financial strategy sets that overall foundation of what council is trying to achieve financially, but it also sets some strategic controls around some of our funding mechanisms, around limits on rates and limits on debt. And so it has to operate within those contexts of what the financial strategy delivers.
It specifically then goes to think about, well, for each of our activities then how we're going to fund them, thinking about what we're trying to achieve financially, and we've got a mix of tools that we can use around general rates, targeted rates, grants, fees and charges, interest and dividends, borrowing, and other sources like asset sales or development of financial contributions. So we look at that list and we have to make some decisions about, for each of our activities, what of those tools are we going to use. And then that then flows through into our annual plan and our LTP when we actually decide for targeted rates and general rates how much we're going to collect, and also what mechanism we're going to collect those under. So whether we're going to do it on a capital value basis or land value, whether we're going to use differential or a uniform fixed amount. And so that's what this policy does. It sets basically the bands of funding that we're looking for each of our activities and which tool we're going to use to fund each of those activities. So how do we make the decisions in terms of that? So we've got some legislative aspects that we need to consider in terms of determining what are the appropriate sources of funding. And we've talked about these quite a lot. We've had a few workshops. So we need to be thinking about for each activity is what is council's objectives and community outcomes, and how does the funding tool maybe support them, or making sure the funding tool is not working against those. Looking at the distribution of benefits to the community as a whole, or to parts of the community and to individuals, and the period over which those benefits occur. Also, if there's actions of people that cause costs, so you might have, like in our roading rate model, we say that heavy traffic users cause a bit more damage, so we want to target our funding tool to try and recover some of that cost from those people who are causing that. And also in terms of thinking about the cost and benefits of separately funding activities, so this is really around how do we want to show to our community how we're funding this, either as part of the LTP, as an activity statement, or through the way we rate and having separate rates to convey how we're funding that activity, to give some visibility, or to show that for accountability purposes. So once we do that for each of our activities, we then step back and we apply the LTP numbers and we apply our thinking. We need to think about what's the impact of that on our community overall. And as a result of that, we might think about changing our mix of funding. So if we think that there's an issue of affordability, we might make an adjustment. Or if we think the fees, setting the fees on that basis of that analysis in step one might be too high, we might adjust that and use other funding tools. So that's the theory of how it works. So in this, and like I've said previously to you, it's your judgment really around that step two. So that's where you come in with your political views and can tweak things either way. So just in terms of what the current way our funding mix is, just some context. So in terms of when you roll that all up at the moment, around 24% of our activities are coming through general rates, 41% through targeted rates. So targeted means it's like an area of service, or it might be they get a particular service like rubbish bins or something like that in the district, or it might be a geographical area like the community board rates that we have at the moment, or a hall rate. Grants and subsidies make up about 23%, and fees and charges are about 8%, and the rest of the income sources are around 4%. So when we've embarked on this policy and rating review process, we've had an aim. We haven't been really renegotiating everything. We've had a really targeted review about things that we know needed changing, and so we've been focused on those. And we've also been focused, you'll see in the policy, around trying to articulate that policy story a bit better in the council's rationale for its thinking. So the areas that we've targeted around those local activities, we've had a look at the roading rate, we've looked at the way we fund water and wastewater, waste management, environmental services, and how we strike our general rate. Those are the areas that we're focused on. So our process is we've had workshops with relevant elected members, you guys, and community boards as well. And we've developed work papers for those workshops to seek your guidance on that. And as a result of all those discussions, the policy that you've got in front of you today incorporates all that sort of thinking and provides the funding bands that we're looking at. And from here, what we'd be doing is also we're trying to seek some early feedback. Normally, a lot of councils would consult on this policy at the same time that they're doing the LTP, because there is some linkages in terms of what the budgets in the LTP are and how they need to be funded, and that actually we might need to make some adjustments to our funding mechanisms because of that. And the approach we're taking is doing some early feedback, particularly around the changes we're making for local activities and how they're rated, to get that out of the way so we lock and load that, So when the LTP goes out, we've got that nailed and bolted, and we don't have that as a question mark when we're consulting on the LTP. But we do acknowledge there's a risk of that there might be some additional changes we need to make once we finish the budgeting and LTP process. We might need to go out again with any further tweaks, particularly as part of that step 2 of the process that we were talking about before. And if we do that, we'll be consulting concurrent. If we need to do that, we'll do that concurrently. So in terms of the outcomes, so the process that we've been through, there's actually limited overall change in terms of policy direction. Much of it is very consistent with what we've had before. There are a specific few funding tools that we're adding and tweaking the proportions that we're capturing from each of those. And the main change is really around how those local activities like footpaths, like stormwater, like halls, almost not halls, sorry, like cemeteries are being funded. And it's just also to point out that while the policy sets limits on what council can fund, the proportion of activities that they can fund for the different tools, because we use bands, there's an element of flexibility in here as well, so that when we have got some room to move, and the policy is just basically saying council thinks it's appropriate between this amount and this amount, that we're going to collect that. The LTP sets the exact amount that we're going to collect. So this is more of an enabling thing to say we look to use this tool and we look to give ourselves some flexibility in that tool for funding our activities as part of that process. So I just wanted to talk you through a little bit about articulating the thinking just in terms of so you understand what each of the bits that are in the policy talk about. So this is an example for halls. So you'll see there's a table in the document like this. And this first section really is articulating around the community outcomes and the linkages and thinking about who is benefiting from that. So we can think about, when we get to the end of thinking about how we're funding, are we on track with that? Is it in alignment or are we working against that? The distribution of benefits, so you'll see these are all really related to legislation. So here we're describing is the benefit to the whole community, is it low, medium or high, and what's the nature of that benefit, trying to put some words around that. Identifiable parts and individuals, and then around describing anybody who's creating need for the activity, and whether the period of benefit is in the current years or whether it's got a longer life, like some of those pipes have quite a long life, so the expenditure is not just about the benefit in that year, it can go on for future years. And we have some discussion there about council's view on the cost and benefits of separate funding. And then we take all of those steps and then we make a bit of an assessment about what the public benefit is. So and we put a bit of a percentage number on there between public and private to give a bit of an indication. And then we've stepped back from that and looked at the rationale for funding and overall and how we might fund those things, and we've adjusted that public-private benefit for any of those sort of step 2 considerations. And then we're using that to then pick our funding choices. Typically a general rate, a public benefit, it might be funded from the general rate, or if we're talking about the public benefit for identifiable parts of the community, that might be coming through the community board rate. Fees and charges are where we've got an individual benefit, so we're going to charge a fee or a charge to individuals. So that's the theory of the table. And when we talk about low, medium and high in there, we're talking about between 0 to low is 0 to 33% of the revenue is going to come from that source. Medium is 33 to 67% and high is 67 to 100. So I just wanted to get that out of the way so you all understood that table, because that's part of the articulation of the policy story. So in terms of the detail of what we're looking at changing, so like I said, local activity funding is really one of the key areas that we've been looking at. And so our aims for looking at this was really around specifically considering those legislative obligations, particularly around benefit, transparency and accountability in our outcomes, addressing inconsistencies in the way we were funding these local activities, simplifying, reflecting our new representation structure and looking at our council vision. And repeatedly as it come up through this process is that rating is never going to be a perfect user paid system. So this is just about getting something that's about right or feels about right, but it's not going to be perfectly representative of benefit. And so it was all those activities that we mean when we mean local activities, all those things of representation, litter bins, cemeteries, beautification, stormwater, parks and reserves, all of those sorts of things down the bottom is what we looked at. And in terms of our current approach, just recapping as well, we have, like I said, we have a variable approach. We have existing community board areas which are shown in the yellow areas in the map, and they pay for those are local activities. And we have CDA rating areas in the green, and they pay. The areas in the grey will pay a little bit through the award rate towards these local activities, but that will vary depending on whether the ward is making a contribution or not. Okay? And the blue areas are our new community board boundaries. So we needed to look at a way of bringing consistency through. So what have we done? So we had quite long discussions with community boards about understanding the benefits and exacerbators for these activities. So what's the nature of the benefit they're providing, who is benefiting, who therefore should expect to be contributing to the cost, and how should they pay. So we talked a lot with them about that. And the result of that was boards really saw, when we think about that map and we think about their board areas, they actually felt like everybody in their board areas and everybody in the district is benefiting to some degree from these activities that they're providing, which wasn't being reflected in the way we fund at the moment. And there were some activities where it was more parts of the community, and that was really around whether service is or is not provided by council. So some boards don't have certain services like swimming pools, so therefore they didn't feel like they should be paying for swimming pools. So yeah, there was a lot of consensus around that. And then when we talked about who should pay, we had some discussions about actually some of these activities aren't just the local community that's benefiting, it's wider than that, it's across the whole district. And you'll see that coming through in terms of the proposals for the funding changes. Where there was a identifiable benefit across the whole district, we're proposing either a district-wide target rate or some general rate funding, or general rate funding for those activities. So the key problem that we were facing is that we actually had those differences in who's paying for the same activity, despite the fact that everybody agreed that everybody's benefiting. So we wanted to try and fix that up, basically, and get some consistency. So we discussed with council around that. We discussed the feedback from the boards, and we developed some options that we might look at. And those options were really, we could rate across the whole district, we could rate across the community boards for those, we could just make the urban people pay, or we could do urban rural differential. And so we really identified our preferences up there, and that was really around slightly differently for different services and activities. So when it came to local representation, cemeteries and litter bins, that benefit was really, there was general agreement that that was actually the whole district. So those are the ones that are being proposed to be funded at a district level through the general rate. And then for footpaths, playgrounds, parks, mowing, things like that, the community boards look after. They agreed that actually everybody in their community board area should be paying for those services, but actually those people that live or have closer access to those services, generally in the urban areas, if you've got a footpath outside, just outside your property, you use it more, they should pay more than the people that live further away. So that's where we looked at introducing a differential. So urban would get a 1 charge and rural would get a 1/4 charge. And that was really the reason that that it was still staying in the community board area was that we recognised that community boards can choose different services and different levels of services, and therefore there can be quite big differences across the district in what's being provided. So we wanted to ensure that the funding for that wasn't consistent across everybody, but we were allowing for those differences to be funded by those individual communities based on their choices. We also looked at stormwater, so that was also one that we recognised that there was general benefit to everybody. So because they come to different towns where stormwater services are provided and use those services, so they receive a benefit, but it's not to the same level. And so that's where we're also providing a differential there to differentiate between serviced and unserviced areas and getting payment. Yeah, and what people pay will vary depending on if they live in a serviced area or if they live in an unserviced area. For halls and pools, we looked at that, but we didn't make any changes for those. Those are staying the same, so there are separate rating areas at the moment for those, and they'll stay in place. And council also talked about CASA funding with the board, a discussion around having some local rate input into that. And we talked about Stewart Island duties as well, and we're looking at some addition of general rate funding for that. So we came up with that, and that was council's preference, and that was then discussed again with community boards And as a result of those discussions, the community boards had a concern about there just being two differential categories for the community board, rural and urban. And so we've introduced a semi-urban category as well for those smaller communities that have most of the services but not to the same degree as some of the bigger communities have a bigger infrastructure. So we've introduced that as a result of that. So I really wanted to just snapshot that so that we can remind ourselves that we've just not come up with this. We've been through quite a robust process, and that's how we've arrived at where we're at, and it's involved quite a lot of discussion already with those boards. So like I said, so where we ended up, so we're looking at a new community board rate. So we're going to have each community board area will have a rate with a differential. There'll be an urban, they'll get people that are defined as urban will have a full charge, semi-urban will have a half charge, and rural will have a quarter charge. And the amount that everybody pays will vary depending on what the budgets are for those activities in that community board area. Stormwater will be funded across the district. If you live in a serviced area, you'll pay $46. If you live in an unserviced area, you'll pay $12. Now I need to counter that and say this is on current budgets because we were trying to compare apples with apples without putting in the LTP budgets. So these are what, if we were to redo it today, what it would look like, but these numbers will adjust when we do the LTP and apply what the new budgets are to that. And then local representations was across the district as part of the general rate at $17. Cemeteries, everybody paying as part of the general rate at $5, and litter bins, everybody paying the same at $16. So that was council's preferences, and that's what you'll see reflected in the policy. And there's a table there, I think in attachment B, that just talks about what the impact of that is. So if we look at what the area is that's currently been funded through their community board or CDA rate, or if they're considered rural, how they're classified under the new system for community boards and for stormwater, what differentials applied, and so we can compare the grey column, which is what they currently pay, with the dark blue column, which is what they will pay apples with apples, and then the light blue is actually, once we've taken those things off, what the revised community board rate is, and then we're adding back in the litter bins, cemeteries and stormwater, and that gets us to the dark blue. So that gives you an idea of the transition between those two things. So yeah, so that's that bit. I always don't know whether to pause or keep going.
Well, has anyone got any questions at the moment to hear? I'm sure that you will have a few. Councillor Scott.
Not a question, just a comment, Your Worship. Just wanted to commend the delivery of the whole sort of process. I think that going backwards and forwards between community board and council and bringing the staff along to community boards, I think it's given us a platform for a really robust decision. So yeah, I thought it was great.
Councillor Duffy.
I'd just like to support that. At the last community board meeting out at Wyndham, Anne Robson and Karen Perdue were there with these very easily understand charts, and it was so simple, really.
Absolutely.
Well explained.
Picture says 1,000 words.
Okay, so I think the report itself does talk about those specific items. So unless councils have got anything they want to renegotiate on those particular items, I'll move on to the next specific item, which was really just recapping in terms of SIASA. So this is specific to the Stewart Island Community Board. In the report, I'll step back from that and say, so SIASA funding, there was a concern about the ongoing sustainability of that operation in terms of they were funding quite a bit of their activity from reserves, and we needed to look at a mechanism to give them the money that they actually needed to run. And the reason the reserve funding was that they had some increases in their costs related to management fees, and they didn't want that to fully come in and impact their community, so they've been using reserves to do that. So we've talked to the community board a little bit about how do we want to fund this deficit, and it was in the region of $150,000 to $200,000 annually. And in this process, it was about trying to find, because in the delivery of SIASA, there's fixed costs and variable costs. So the fixed costs are things like the staff and the management fees and the generators, and the variable costs are the things like maintenance items to keep the lines running, and also diesel to keep the generators running. So we wanted to find a way to sort of a new funding mechanism to help with the fixed costs, and ensuring that the variable costs are set right. So The board's proposed that we actually introduce a local rate to assist with the fixed cost components of the CACR activity in terms of those management and having the staff there to deal with these sorts of things. In addition to the consumption charge, which is variable, and the fixed monthly line charge. So the report signalled that we were just doing some checking on our ability to charge this fixed charge. So we've had confirmation from the Electricity Authority, that there's nothing in any of the regulations that would prohibit council from setting its own fee or setting its own rate to assist with this activity. So there's no problem there. So what the board has discussed doing is introducing a $200 rate for those people who are connected to the existing supply, and a half charge of $100 for properties that the lines go past but they're not connected. And so there's around 203 of those on the island, and that would generate those figures that are up shown on the screen. They're also proposing to increase the consumption charge slightly to increase income, and increase the monthly charge slightly to increase income. So overall we get to the sort of deficit number that we needed to get to. Yeah, so that's something that's we're going to be consulting and talking to the community board over there about. Obviously the locals might have something to say about that, but that will be part of the process. Yeah. So any feedback on or just comments on that item before I move on? Right. So Stewart Island duties.
Sorry.
Just that SISA charges, the board are pretty comfortable with having a go at that.
Yeah.
Was one way to add some additional revenue, and certainly nobody wants to pay any more, but we have to face that fact. That's the way of getting it.
Still to be consulted on.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so in terms of water facilities, there was a specific consideration coming out of the Stewart Island Sustainability Review that was done that instructed staff to look at and consider the funding for jetties during the review of this policy. And that was really around just obviously it's a small community, you know, they've got quite a lot of services, and the ability to pay for all of those services can be difficult at times. And they have, and in particular with jetties, they have quite a bit of infrastructure that does have a lot of capital costs. So we've been through this process with the board, and some of the issues were really about the level of maintenance and renewal that was being done was insufficient. And we've also just recently taken on Golden Bay as well, which means there's some new costs that need to be funded. And the user fees, so at the moment the activity is fully funded by user fees, and those user fees aren't really at a level at which we can recover all the costs that we need to do to maintain these assets to the level that we want it to. So in the policy document there is a table that sort of talks about this benefit analysis that we've done. I've forgotten what number it's on. It's on somewhere, page somewhere, deep, dark, buried. Page 177 of the agenda. But the key part here is the discussion that we've really had with the community board. Actually, I'll just jump to the next slide first. Is we've talked to them about who are the beneficiaries of this activity and what would be appropriate levels of funding. So in those discussions, we've talked about the fact that the locals use these wharfs, and that actually it's probably appropriate that we do look for a range of funding from them for this activity. And so in this policy, we're proposing between 0 and 10% of that cost should be paid for by the Stewart Island Community Board ratepayers. We currently collect 100% from commercial users, and we're looking at collecting between 60 and 70%. And the reason that we're moving away from that is we recognise there is a level of public benefit of these wharfs and jetties, and we also want to ensure that the fees and charges that we charge aren't a disincentive to them to keep operating. So there is that whole economic aspect that we want to look at. Grants and subsidies, so we're recognising that we would like to actually be talking to the Visitor Levy Committee about having ongoing funding to assist with the operating and maintenance of these duties at the moment, which we don't get, which is would be funded through the Visitor Levy. And we're proposing that somewhere between 0 and 20% of the funding should come from that. And then the third thing is a general rate, in reflecting on the fact that a lot of people in Southland and New Zealand use these jetties and wharfs when they visit the island or for recreation, and also recognising the benefit that they provide in terms of supporting the economy of both the island and the wider Southland area. And then you'll see in the policy wording that we had there, the third component of that is really around the fact that the burden that's placed on that local community to have these high infrastructure costs is quite a lot. And so based on that, council believes it's appropriate because of all of those items to provide some general rate funding for that. So in terms of, like I said, the revenue and financing process sets that range of what proportion of funding we're looking for. In terms of just some context around that, so I think when we spoke last, we weren't entirely sure about what the funding that would be needed for the GTs on the island were, and that's around 132,000 an annum. We'll be agreeing those amounts in the LTP yet, still to come.
Sorry, Nicole, does that include depreciation, replacing the jetties?
Yeah.
No, that's just the funding at this stage, that's unfunded.
Yeah.
Depreciation is unfunded.
So in terms of what does that mean, so for the local rate, that means that we'll need about up to $13,000 from the local rate based on this funding formula, which would be about $27 a property. And from the general rate, if it was between 0 and 30, if it was the upper end, that would be about $40,000 in total, which would be about $2.50 per property in Southland. Yeah, so that's sort of that issue that if any councillors have anything to.
Yes,
I'll just, because this is a change in terms of moving towards some district funding, I'd be really interested to see what the public thoughts on this are, particularly given our range is between 0 and 30%. Like if that, I don't know, if when we go out for public consultation, if they're going to give us specifics around that, or if we prompt them in any way from the guidance in the area on where this is sitting with them, because that's potentially a big shift with future costs.
And
thank you,
thank you, Your Worship. When's the community and Stuart on looking at the possibility of rationalising these jetties? Because they don't last very long, like 10 years I think was the figure we were given recently, and it costs about $1 million per jetty. When's the community going to look at
10 years? It's 50 years, isn't it, Mr. Russell?
Through you, Your Worship, yes, for a jetty we're essentially looking at 30 to 50 years, and certainly $1 million per asset is not anywhere near the valuation or replacement cost we would be touting for each of the 6 jetties on the island. There's a spectrum of size and scale and remaining useful life associated with those assets currently.
Patterson Inlet was $2 million to replace, was it? Patterson, the Golden Bay Wharf, that was getting close to $2 million, I think, was it? 1.8?
Yeah, so some of those figures are still in public excluded, Councillor. Be aware.
So I think it's useful to point out is like we've had quite a philosophical approach to this, and that we do have that discussion about LTP budgets and actual amounts to come, and that's the point at which council can decide. Council can equally decide to be at the 0% level, in terms of its funding, depending on what it is. I think what we're seeking today is approval to go out and ask the community whether they think that range of 0 to 30%, they'd be willing to live with that, knowing that the actual amount that we set may also be subject to a consultation as part of the LGP as well.
But that 132,000 which you're going out to consult on isn't actually accurate as far as the cost of those jetties is concerned.
So that amount is based on what's in the current budget for the 10 years, and it's an average amount of the annual amount.
Annual maintenance.
The annual maintenance, and there is some renewal in there of GTs, of specific GTs.
So although there's no level of funding of depreciation, there is a level of funding of the loan and principal repayments that occurs on some of those duties that need to be replaced in that period.
So I think it's worthwhile that when the staff finalise that and it goes to the community board, that comes back to council, just for your information, so you can understand that bigger picture of what's happening in that activity.
It's given an indication of what may be required, and that's what the comments will come back, as Councillor Owen said, probably create some discussion.
Through you, Your Worship, if I may, the 2 renewals that are proposed for the LTP period incorporate the 2 most significant GTs
think it'd be worth a session with council to, once you've nailed that, to come in and have that discussion with the board. The board are meeting in next month to review their budgets and things like that. So at which point they'll be talking about a lot of what we've been talking about as well.
And I think it's really important while we're going out to communicate with the public over this policy that we do give them that indication of potentially that range, but also what it does mean to them on a per property basis, so that we get that contextual.
Well, I think my point was that I didn't think that was an accurate number, given that it doesn't take into account the replacement or the depreciation of those
And I think we
structures.
can definitely expand on that a little bit further to explain exactly what that does cover off of it.
Okay, Councillor Keys, Councillor Ford.
Thank you, Worship. Just for clarification, so from there, the 132,000 per annum, which is subjective, I suppose, as to how much it is, but 30% of that works out on if we were taking 30% of it to the general rate, it's $2.50 per property.
Correct. Yeah. Around about, not perfect, but rough enough. Yeah.
$2.50.
Councillor Ford.
Just to comment that that's really the best shot we've had of it so far. That looks like it's got the possibilities of working, and as far as Ulveron is concerned, we do have some funds allocated to that, and once we go to market we'll get some more accuracy as to what those requirements might be, because they are estimates. So really, until you go to market, we're unsure.
So I just was going to say as well, under the formula, based on what we sort of talked about, 60% when we're talking to the board about the commercial users fees, and that would equate to about $80,000 of the activity that would still be being recouped from those users, which is quite a lot more than what they currently pay, which I think is around $30,000. So we've got some discussions to have there with those commercial users as well in terms of that and that mix and how we actually portion that. So we've still got quite a bit of work to do as part of the LGP, but this policy is just setting that guideline of what we want.
Thank you. Any other comments around this specific point? Okay, Nicole.
Oh, okay. So Tiana Airport. So there was a placeholder in the agenda yesterday, sorry, that was sent out last week, just to say that we haven't discussed this as part of our process. It's come subsequently from the Tiana Community Board, Fiordland Community Board in terms of request. So what have they specifically come and asked for? So they have asked us, Council, to consider to provide some district funding in whole or part for capital expenditure and possibly operating expenditure related to the Tiana Amanapuri Airport activity. At this point in time, they've suggested excluding the current loan that sits there for the airport in terms of the terminal that was developed, and they are indicating that that should continue to be paid solely by those in the Fiordland area. So in terms of when we think about that benefit assessment that we've been applying to everything else, so we've sort of talked to them about on what basis they're thinking that, and so it's in terms of the whole community is got some sort of benefit from its provision in terms of it's an alternative transport option in terms of an emergency or a flood event or for evacuations, which occurred in February with the floods. February? Yeah. Also, I think there's been a bit of discussion on the agenda today as well about the airport being of strategic importance to Southland. Particularly in terms of its future potential as a transport hub for Milford or a staging post alternative to Queenstown. And that was one of the issues that's raised in the Southland Murihuku destination strategy. And also, I've noted in there it's currently a strategic asset, and it still is, following your discussion today for consultation. So the feedback was really, if it's a strategic asset that the district has an interest in, should the district be contributing to that? So that was the basis on which the board's thinking was at, and able to be able to add anything, but I'll keep going until the end. So just interesting to note the policy thinking, which is on page 177 of the agenda. It goes through that benefit thinking. It does raise a number of those points, and like when I talked you through that, it actually identifies that there's about between 0 and 15% public benefit to the whole district really around the airport. Okay, and at the moment the policy stated that that was unfunded in terms of any general rate. It was just acknowledging there is a benefit, but actually we're going to fund it entirely through fees and charges and targeted rates on that local community area. So Financial Insurance met yesterday and we talked through the policy, and as a result of those discussions and the points that have been raised, they endorsed making a change to the draft policy to allow for some funding from the district, basically to allow us to hear public feedback on what actually people out there think. They were interested for that to be canvassed as an option that Council's considering. So as a result of that, I've adjusted the wording in the policy as proposed to reflect that discussion, and also to add in the general rate as being a funding tool. However, it's your subjective judgment about whether you think that's what you want to do or not, and I note that this isn't something that you've had a chance as a team to discuss, so it's here for you today. In terms of what that means, so if I use my range of 0 to 15%, just like we did with the GTs, noting that the actual amounts would need to be agreed in the LGP. Based on the current budget, there's about 131,000 in there for operating and capex costs, excluding the loan that we talked about. So that would mean it would be up to $20,000 of general rate funding, and that would be at $1.25 per property. I've also just put a note there to say that indicative LTP budgets for the airport suggest that there's some capex in the next couple of years to do with resurfacing the runway, so that would be around 1.5 million in total over year 1 and year 2. So that will have an influence on the amount of money needed on an annual basis to fund that. So yeah, I will stop talking again.
Any questions around that one? Councillor Kramer.
Thank you, Worship. I suppose it reverts back to the previous discussion we had with regards to the airport being a strategic asset, and this here just follows on from that. And I think it's important to note that it's not a decision process for today when we go down this particular path, but provides an opportunity for the rest of the district to actually discuss this and think about it and come back with their opinions. We can see that there's some real opportunities there. We've got an opportunity to explore some of those possibilities at the airport, how we can generate additional revenue. There's some real good options there that can be had, and certainly Milford Opportunities, Great South and other agencies can see that as well. So it's linked to the future of our district, and therefore I say it's the opportunity to go out to our community and say, right, here's an option. So I think that's the important part today, that we provide that opportunity to our communities.
Councillor Byers, Councillor Owen.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'm surprised this council's listed that airport as a strategic asset, given that all it's done is cost that community money for the last 10 years, and the runway's fallen apart and requires significant capital investment. Now, if Great South or Milford Opportunities comes up with a good idea to utilise the airport, then that would be wonderful. But I just think it's a little bit much to be passing the cost of that. I mean, it's $1.25 a property, but you take into account the capital expense, we're soon up to $25 per property across the district. So I think it's a little bit much, really, to be suggesting that the district pay for a failing asset.
A little bit strong to say that it's falling apart. It's general maintenance. That's my understanding.
Well, it needs replaced, I think.
Yeah,
It's not.
The top.
It's not replaceable.
It's the apron, I understand, isn't it?
Yes.
So there are still aircraft going there. So I would hate for the media to put in there that the airport is falling apart.
Definitely not.
Sorry, falling apart.
Councillor Owen.
I would be really interested to see what the public's views on whether they consider that the airport has district-wide benefits, because I think one, that's contingent upon it being used, and two, contingent on it being that those visitors actually travelling further than just a typical route of into Milford or not. So, so there obviously needs to be some work done. It is, I think, a strategic asset, but it's not being utilised in the way that it could be or was originally envisaged at the moment. And that further work definitely needs to be done. And only in doing that could we justify, I think, to ratepayers to pass that cost on to the district.
Which is what I feel we'll hear from public consultation. Councillor Menzies, Councillor Scott.
Thank you, Worship. I too agree with the previous comments. I think we need a lot more information to be able to make a decision longer term, but I appreciate that there's a timeliness around getting feedback from the public in the district, so I agree with it on that basis.
Councillor Scott.
Thanks, Your Worship. Just similar to what Councillor Menzies said, but I think also in the context of the public engagement, if we put that information in there as well, what Councillor Kramer was saying about the opportunities coming up with the changes and those sort of things, I think it's important the public actually get the full picture as to what the potential future opportunities are.
Councillor Douglas, Councillor Kramer, I thought I saw your hand go before. An auctioneer.
Just to re-emphasise that when that airport was constructed, it was before my time, there was a call out to the public to see if there was any interest in the private sector picking up the possibility to develop that airport. And there was one company that put their hand up. And I think we need to acknowledge that. So as we go through this information process, that we clearly identify the full picture. Some of the concerns around the table here are justified, I can understand that. And because it hasn't been well utilised, there were opportunities that were unable to be followed up on. And I think it's important that the district understands that, so we provide that basis as to what's occurred in the past and what's possible for the future. So I think we need to give credit where credit's due. That there was one organisation said, even under the financial worldwide constraints at that time, they still put their hand up and said, we will take the risk, and they did. And of course, the airport was sort of locked up to provide that opportunity for that to occur. So I think it's important when we tell the story, we need to tell the whole story, the history, and how we can go forward. And it picks up on the comments that have been made by other councillors here as well.
Yeah, well said, Councillor Kramer. Yeah. We both know that person who put their head on the block, really. Sorry, Councillor Douglas.
Yeah, no, much of it has been said. So, but if we went out and just consulted on giving the ability to rate across the district, I think we'd get an unfavourable response. But if we went out and said we would like to do that, but in conjunction with that we're going to develop this business case which is going to explore every avenue of increasing and developing any and every economic opportunity, because we've done it in piecemeal in the past, but we haven't actually made a lot of traction. You know, I know of pilots that want to gain hangarage at that airport, and you know, hangarage and accommodation, that's just one aspect of developing the airport. Others are bringing scheduled flights, others are linking in with the exploration of doubtful sound. I mean, so there's a heap there that would, if it was all implemented, would add to the overall economic viability of that airport, and we need to explore that with some haste.
I'm sure that's been listened to in the past, and we need to keep pushing it for the future, but it's not something we need to debate here today. I'm sorry, folks. Councillor Keast.
Thank you, Worship. Yeah, probably along those lines that we're sort of getting bogged down into the detail here. I see that this policy actually makes us be able to be more flexible. This is their one chance in 3 years to review it, and so we need to put in parameters that will allow us to move somewhat when opportunities present. We'll still have to consult on any major changes, if there was major changes coming up outside a long-term plan, or sorry, an annual plan cycle, but this gives us that flexibility that we've probably lacked in the past to actually be able to move a bit more quickly than we have been.
It's a very good start, and as Councillor Owen quite rightly said, that will create some conversation.
It does.
Is there any other comments or questions around this part of it?
We just got one with the end because you're sick of my voice.
So just probably one further question. We probably are a little bit more specific with some of our other issues about the type of rate that we would use.
Do you want to bring that up? Sorry.
So I don't know whether the council would like to actually give a little bit more direction to the public as to what rate possibly, if it was a district rate.
So the difference is most of the time we've been saying we're going to fund this through the general rate. Now, like with stormwater, you have the opportunity to have a separate rate, which, you know, that in terms of the separate need, that could be a separate targeted rate across the whole district. So we'll cover that as well. So we can do it that way, or we can do it through the general rate, basically. And it was just, at the moment, I've assumed that we do that through the general rate because it's consistent with sort of the approach that we've been taking for other similar sorts of things. But if you wanted it to be shown more separately, then there was the option to do that through a separate targeted rate. But that has some costs around, you know, having that rate and some administration around that. Yeah.
It would be listed somewhere, so what would be the problem with the general rate?
Not a problem, it's just a specific question because we haven't had that conversation.
So the general rate has, of course, two components to it. There's a fixed component and it has a capital value.
Right.
Right. So there is a portion where you can just assign more to the fixed component, but there is equally, you could decide to have a capital component in there. I guess it's whether you wish to or whether you just wish to leave it generic like that and say, actually, we'll decide that after we receive the feedback as to the rating choice that we've done.
What's the discussion around that? I feel that that's probably more appropriate to wait.
I agree, because I think the implications of it would be clearer once we've had the knowledge.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that correction.
Okay, so I'm just going to head back to the report now because there's a couple of items that I just want to talk about that I don't have slides for, if that's okay. So I'm on page 157 and I'm just talking about the waste management rate. So we are proposing a change as well to the waste management rate, and it's more around administration than anything else, and administration efficiency. Currently we have a separate district-wide targeted rate for waste management which funds transfer stations, green waste sites, recycling drop-off centres. And we are proposing that this become part of the general rate because it's set on a very similar basis, and just for efficiency of rating, it's based on that. We'll include that in the general rate. The public benefit nature of those things are very similar to some of the other activities that we've got in the general rate, so for that reason there's no need to separately identify it. And also it is the source of a bit of confusion with our ratepayers in terms of the difference between this rate that is listed on the rating notice and things like the wheelie bin, rubbish and recycling rate. So we've talked a little bit about that and we've also talked about the importance of when it comes to explaining what's in the general rate, we really need to make sure that we do a good job of doing that so our ratepayers can see what activities are actually funded through that mechanism. And that's one of the things that the rates team are working with the communications team on. How can we make sure that we tell that story and have that information available? But any comments on that? The last item was really of change. Well, not of change, it's actually one of no change, but I just wanted to highlight we did consider quite extensively about whether we wanted to change the way that we do our wastewater rating. So at the moment we do that on a residence. A residence gives a fixed amount, one fixed charge per property. A vacant section gets a half charge, and commercial or other use they get charged for each pan that they have on their property. So they have multiple pan charges. So it's just, we talked about the benefits and we talked about the nature of those benefits for those commercial users that have got more pans, and generally we felt that our current approach was appropriate, but we will be talking a bit about that in our consultation document to say we've considered this, but we're happy with what we've got, so we're not making any changes around that. So I just wanted to highlight that today as well.
And did you want to highlight that change that Councillor Duffy found last night on page 100?
Oh yeah, sorry, I should correct that. So just on 155, was it?
155, item 42.
Yeah, so just, I've missed a couple of numbers off. So there's actually 3 changes. So steward line should actually be $146 in terms of the rate that they're going to be charged. The 231 was my mistake, it was what they currently pay. To a taproot to Waiwai, the urban is 196, the semi-urban should be 98, and the rural is actually 49. And it's exactly the same for Waihopo to Toi as well. So they are the same, 196, 98 and 49.
Thank you. Okay, any other comments or questions around this, Councillor Owen, Councillor Byers?
Just in relation to the communication around the PAN charges, because I know it is a tough point at the moment for a lot of accommodation operators who are paying those PAN taxes, but if we can communicate exactly what that goes towards and why we've made the decision to this point to stick with the way that we are doing it, because in their minds they're not using them as much as they would normally, so why they're paying the same. So I think that needs clarity in the communication.
Councillor Byers.
Thank you, Your Worship. Oh, sorry, I'm moving off the wastewater, if that's all right. We're going to talk about freshwater shortly. So the stormwater, moving that to a district-wide rate, does that mean that local communities or community boards will have less input into how stormwater is managed through their communities?
Yeah, so this came up yesterday at Financial Insurance as well, in terms of that. So when we've talked to community boards as well about through this process about what happens if they no longer set the rate and that's done by the council as a whole, what does that mean in terms of their opportunity to input? So we've got quite a bit of feedback saying that, you know, particularly for certain activities where there's high visibility, they would still like to have input, not necessarily into the rate setting process, but what's planned and programmed in their communities, in case they get questions from the community about what's occurring and why that's occurring, but also to give advice for staff about, you know, if staff are proposing something and they don't think it's necessary, there's an opportunity for that feedback to go into the planning process. So that's something that Matt and his team are also working on about how that will actually work and function, and I think there was a bit of discussion yesterday from Matt suggesting that an appropriate place to do that might be through the terms of reference for each of the community boards and making it clear whether they do or don't have a role in that. So I think what I wanted to highlight was through this process it's come through quite clearly about what the board's expectations are. It doesn't form part of this policy, but I think we need to look at our other mechanisms of how we work with boards and also around what the delegations in terms of reference are for those boards, to provide some guidance to staff about how we do that. So it's not, this is an issue that it's not my area of expertise, there's other areas of council that this relies on, and so I'd be looking for us to take that feedback away and then work with the relevant staff and then come back to you with a proposal about how we plan to manage that to ensure that we can use.
Because the water is pretty important. I mean, people value the water, and the storm water is where the water moves through their community. So,
and I guess it's important to distinguish what we're doing here is saying who's going to basically tick off, you know, the budget or the rate setting process. You know, who gets that sign off. It doesn't necessarily mean that prohibits any input or discussion by local community boards about what makes up those budgets in the areas and what's programmed, and for those views about what they feel about movement of water through their local area.
Thanks,
Matt, did you have any other comment about that?
Thank you, through your worship.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments or questions around this matter? Certainly been, as you said earlier, a robust discussion over the last wee while, and appreciate that. So we need to...
I just wanted to highlight, there are a couple of just minor tweaks that I'm going to do with the delegation of the Chief Executive. There were just
so
a
we've
couple
got
of
probably
minor
got those up
areas.
there, have we? That'll be included in the bottom there that the Chief Executive can approve.
Absolutely,
Okay, is there the changes are up on the board behind me. Obviously A, B and C remain the same, and D has been changed, as you see there, and E and F. Sorry?
E might be release, is it? Agrees to release.
Oh yeah, good stuff.
I've got to leave something in to make sure you're reading it.
Release the draft. We could lease it.
No, I don't think anybody wants to pay for their policy.
They'll be paid at some stage.
Okay, so they are the changes that have been made during the discussions here today. Are there any issues with that? If not, is there a council that can move?
So
Sorry, indeed, the low in brackets, what's that sort of trying to say?
So that's
It's-
indicating the proportion of funding. So we have bands that we use 0 to
Oh,
33.
you told us that.
It's in the low
Yeah.
band.
Yeah.
I'll shut up.
No, I need to retain it better.
But that would be probably more easy to understand if we put low band rather than just low. Is that okay?
Do you want low?
Yep, low band.
Just removes the doubt.
Yep. No. Okay, so there are the recommendations with those changes. Is the council in a position to move those recommendations? Councillor Scott, seconded Councillor Owen. All those in favour?
Aye.
Against, carried. Thank you very much for that, and we look forward to going out to our communities and getting some feedback from those people in their places. And as was raised by Mr. Capel, it's not only the elected members that need to do this. Well, we're going to break for 15 minutes. So back in here at 11 o'clock, please. this is going to be a discussion document. This one. All right, just okay, so we'll keep moving because we've still got a fair bit to do on the agenda. Everybody on board, or do I need to bang something?
I think you need to hit a gong.
I just need to get the
dog one next door, right?
All right, so we'll move forward. Next item on the agenda is item 7.5, which is the integrated management under the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, and we look forward to an update on this and the recommendations to follow. All yours, team.
Morena workshop, worship councillors and council staff. So I've created a PowerPoint on the integrated management under National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. And yeah, so the report that I've prepared demonstrates the recently implemented National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management and how it impacts Southland District Council planning documents. Freshwater quality is a matter of national significance. Therefore, the National Policy Statement has been released to provide direction for local government on how to carry out their responsibilities. Previously, freshwater management was primarily a regional council responsibility. However, territorial authorities now have more extensive requirements. So as demonstrated on the slide, on the left-hand side is the responsibilities for territorial authorities under the 2014 NPS FM amended 2017. And on the right-hand side is the territorial authorities' responsibilities under the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management 2020. So as you can see, under the NPS FM 2020, there's a lot more responsibility for territorial authorities. Presently, Southland District Council obligations to water quality are outlined in the Southland Regional Policy Statement and are reflected in the Southland District Plan. So, above on the slide is a list of the chapters in the Southland District Plan that mention water quality. Additionally, Free Waters services require resource consent from Environment Southland. There is an integrated management national direction which is becoming more obvious through firstly the release of the Randerson report and now the implementation of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. Its tamana o tuai is the fundamental concept of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. It is evident that the resource management system in New Zealand will become further integrated. Therefore, we recommend that Council works collaboratively with Environment Southland to ensure the provisions within planning documents are consistent across the region, whilst combining resource and continue to obtain guidance from Environment Southland, as they are the experts of freshwater management in Southland. So above on the slides, I've explained how Southland as a whole can overcome this ideal through collaboration, through integrated management, and through taking a holistic approach. I am happy to answer any questions, and in attendance with me is Council's Resource Management Team Leader, Marcus Roy.
Thanks, Lottie. Marcus, you got anything you wish to add?
Yeah, just I guess the attachment to the report, just to point out that it was actually an assignment for Massey University Studies that Olivia's submitted, so hopefully you're of the same opinion that deserved the A mark that it got. So a lot of acronyms in there, but just I guess the report's there just to identify that the National Policy Statement and water reforms aren't just about the services and assets team. Is also going to have a direct impact on the Southland District Plan and also how we integrate with Environment Southland, which is sort of the key messages coming across in this report.
Thank you. Well done. I never got any A's on any of the stuff I did. I can assure you of that. All right, is there any comments or questions from...
Yes, please.
Councillor Ford.
I was a bit curious whether you have any inclinations of what new government do to these things. You know, they've had lots of presiding over politicking time. Will they stay like this? Will something change?
Yeah, probably don't want to comment too much on the result from last weekend, but I think a lot of the motivation I think is still there for doing water quality better, and also a lot of the national direction signalled prior to the election I anticipate will continue through. So in that space, the National Policy Statement for Indigenous Biodiversity I anticipate will continue, and also the Highly Productive Land National Policy Statement I also understand be more in the iwi space too, with the Randerson report, spatial planning, and more integration is outlined in this report. So I think there's probably more of the same would be my view from what I'm seeing on my side of things, and I'm sure there's a range of views on that too.
So it won't intensify, but you don't think they'll ramp it up?
It's difficult to know. I think there will be a continuation we have seen historically. Looking forward, you've got to almost look back. So we have seen an intensification of regulation and more direction from central government historically, and I anticipate that will continue moving forward as they start implementing things and identify if it's working or not. They've got a goal in mind, and I think we will see a stepped approach towards achieving that goal.
Councillor Douglas, Councillor Ravencroft.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. So, very good report, Olivia. So you mentioned collaborating more closely with Environment Southland, and I fully support that. Are there any areas in which we're not fully meeting our obligations to and with Environment Southland? Are there improvements that you see that could be made to improve in that knowledge sharing?
Through Your Worship, I think definitely there can be improvements. So we do work alongside Environment Southland and we do seek advice from them. However, with the with more collaboration required through the legislation coming through, I think it's really important to focus more time and energy on that relationship.
Yeah, and through you, Your Worship, just to add on that too, I think at a staff level we do talk quite frequently, but also at an executive level and political level, there's relationship at multiple tiers that we need to continue working on and having a discussion around integration. Ideally, we don't want to be doing a piece of work that cuts across some of the aspirations that their Environment Southland are doing, and likewise with other territorial authorities in Southland such as Gordon and Chicago, we want to be working combined and doing it so that the people have a really good, clear understanding of exactly what the limits are, so they're not required to get a whole lot of duplication or different bits and pieces that cut across what the other council's doing. So if we work collectively and smart, then we can get a better outcome that's cheaper and easier to understand.
Councillor Ravencroft.
Through you, Your Worship. Thank you for your report. Just about collaboration and relationship building, I was out at AB Line a couple of weeks ago with, they had their Mitariti catchment group there, and involved in that were Environment Southland, Thrive in Southland, and going forward, the amount of work that Thrive in Southland are putting into the fresh waterways, and there's another catchment group meeting up at home next week if anyone was interested in coming. And the work together, I just think it's all about relationships and trying to, and going forward, the amount of time and effort that's going into this is phenomenal, and let's keep going.
Councillor Byers, Councillor Menzies.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Olivia. Good report. I noticed that there's quite a focus on doing reviews and prioritising resources, and we've got specifically relating to activities or how activities will impact water quality, quantity, habitat, aquatic life, ecological processes. Well, this council manages land manages land in a way that's disruptive or polluting to water quality. Riverton at the moment has got streets with just about a metre wide of brown dead plant life which has been sprayed with poison. So this council or organisation's got an opportunity to change the way it manages its infrastructure to...
Just to clarify that, I believe that's NZTA's brain, not Southern District Council.
Through the Riverton Township?
Yeah, it's through the State Highway.
Okay, well, all of
So
our
it's been
all of
straight
our
line.
roads out in the countryside as well. So I'm just throwing the idea out there that this council has got opportunities to make immediate impacts on the quality of water in our community by reducing and eliminating the use of chemicals as a means of managing vegetation. Does that sound fair?
Through you, Your Worship, I believe that could be something that the Three Waters team are looking into, but I'm unsure. It's
Yeah, and I guess it's about making sure that we connect all parts of council through this piece of work. So I know Matt Russell's team's been working on a number of areas building up to the long-term plan. We're also working on our piece of work, our district plan, but I guess it's making sure that all the different parts are connected, like the parks and reserve spaces as well, so how we use our spaces, how do we get the best out of it, what's the community expectation. So I think that's going to be one of the key discussion points as we build into that long-term plan and communication in that space around what the community aspirations are and how we try and get that coordination and really set those values. It also fits into the wider the catchment work that Environment Southland's doing around the Southland values and the limit setting process that they're working into as well. So we need to integrate ourselves into that space as well. So we've got an all Southland approach to how we want to deal with water quality, because everyone's got a part to play. It's not just farmers or urban environment. Everyone's got a role to play and everyone's got value associated with water. So it's just trying to get that integration and get a really good framework and really understand what those values are and how everyone contributes to those values.
Sure, I guess, but we don't have to wait until everyone's on the same page. We can stop using chemicals in the management of our assets for now and continue these talks and reviews, but stop using the chemicals now.
Certainly something we can put on the table, Councillor Vice, but it's probably not where we debate it today. Our Chief Executive's got something to add.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. So I appreciate your point, Councillor Byers. I guess from my perspective and the staff's perspective, having alternative levels of service or ways of delivering service is something that staff can look at, but I think they need to complete the picture that if there is an alternative method of delivery, we need to understand what the implications of that might be, including the cost. And just picking up your point about reducing or eliminating the use of chemicals. So there's a wider picture, or a whole with a W.
W, yes.
Correct.
Well, I mean, it's like the playgrounds. There was a lot of concern around using the chemicals in the playground. There was a lot of concerns about what the alternatives were, but it turns out the alternative is to not use the chemical.
Lots of weeds.
No, weed agent instead.
Oh, yeah, the mowers go down. They already mow the sides of roads.
Yeah,
we don't have to throw up barriers. We can look at practical ways to eliminate the use of chemicals in the management of our infrastructure.
Across the nation.
I mean, if we're serious, because this is what we've got in front of us.
Absolutely.
So going forward, everyone's got a part to play.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you've said. Yeah.
But we don't have to wait for everyone else. We can start.
Councillor Menzies.
Thank you for your report. Just as you know, there's additional responsibilities for Southland District Council. Also, I guess there's additional responsibilities in the process of partnership with iwi, and we're aware of capacity, and you know that makes total sense to be working together, because that means everyone's in the one room having a discussion, hopefully. Do you see that there is a further impact on the ability of iwi to consult in respect of resource to be able to do that, and do we need to have some consideration of that?
Definitely, through you, Your Worship. Yeah, it becomes part of that relationship space, and capacity is definitely going to be an issue. We've got capacity, our scope of work is increasing, but also the expectations on iwi and the local runanga are increasing as well. So for them to have an active engagement and management and direction setting through this process, then they need the capacity to be able to understand and communicate and work through the process with us as well. So I think across the board there's going to be a capacity deficit, and it's about working smarter and making sure that people have got the right resources and got a good relationship and a good platform to have a really robust discussion from. But I think capacity in the iwi space is going to be a concern for them moving forward, because this is one of a number of areas where they're going to be asked for more input and more engagement and more management moving forward.
Particularly around the time frames that are expected as well.
I wonder if perhaps we can learn or acknowledge some of the views of iwi without having to go through an engagement, delaying engagement. Whereas, if we talk to iwi, I think that they would indicate that they value the soil. I think it might be taonga, is it? Oh, sorry. I think they recognise that's where they came from and that's where they're going. So it's a real value placed on the soil. And as far as human waste, I doubt that they would encourage human waste being delivered into water.
Yeah, and I guess just to touch on a couple of those points, I think when we do work with iwi, there's a number of expectations and a lot of work already out there that what their views are already in paper. Like we've got the Untitled Chapter Settlement Act, 1997, got Titangi o Tarawera, and a lot of other bits and pieces that we can draw on to do that piece of work before we have that discussion. So we do the work that we know, and then we sense check that with iwi, as opposed to saying, what do you think about this, what do you think about that? We do the pre-work. So we try and, we're required to do that analysis prior, but coming to them with a summary of what research we've done for them to QA and test is a lot easier, and puts a lot less burden on them in that space. So that's the way we generally work in terms of understanding the context and also bringing that context to a discussion, as opposed to asking, what do you think about this every time you try and have a discussion.
So that happens now. Next month. Okay, are there any other comments or questions around this matter? Councillor Runcorn.
One more question, Marcus. So going forward, like with Thriving Southland being involved in Environment Southland and the research that you're doing, are you collaborating with all these different organisations? And
yeah, through you, Worship, that's how we would see this space evolving. So primarily working with Environment Southland, but also their branches out into the land sustainability team, like land farm plans, also a lot of catchment groups that are voluntary catchment groups. Like there's a huge spider web of connections and communication and teams that are already out there on the ground doing great things, and we just need to make sure that we connect with those groups, and as opposed to trying to re-establish something that's already functioning. I think, there's a sense of ownership and a sense of pride and innovation in Southland that we can really build on and contribute to, as opposed to trying to facilitate and develop something else that would require a whole lot of energy and resource, when we can try and empower others to be in charge of their own catchments and take pride in their sense of ownership in the space. And it's not just in the water space, but it's across multiple different areas of their environment and wider parts of council. So trying to encourage and empower communities to do it for themselves, as opposed to council having to go in and facilitate everything.
I think you would be a strong voice to you guys at catchment group meetings, as well, just going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Byers.
Thank you, Your Worship. I wonder, the farmers get picked on a bit, but I wonder if perhaps there needs to be more recognition for the damage that the urban areas are creating with the mixing of the waste, human waste, with the water, and then the overflows into our environment. And I don't think it's insignificant.
I don't think we really want to start an urban-rural fight.
No, I'm just trying to encourage the recognise that the way we're managing our water in the urban areas is polluting the environment. We're talking about fresh water. If we recognise the issue, then perhaps we can start to consider some ways to deal with that.
Everybody's responsibility, totally agree. All right. No other comments or questions around that? You have the recommendations in regards to this matter on page 259. I'm actually happy to move those recommendations. Is a seconder? Councillor Fraser, all those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thank you for your work on that. Olivia, all the best up in the rabbit country. When do you head up there?
In another couple of weeks.
Okay, thank you for your time down here, and go and enjoy the Central Otago sunshine.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Okay. All right. Next items on the agenda are the operational matters, starting on page 8.1, page 281 of the agenda. So first up is the request for unbudgeted.
Thank you.
What you do. So unbudgeted expenditure for OBAN. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Your Worship. Good morning, councillors. I thought I should introduce myself. Some of you I've had some dealings with, some I haven't. So my name is Brendan. I'm part of the project delivery team here at Southern District Council. My report this morning is to request project and unbudgeted expenditure approval for concrete footpath installation on Main Road on Stewart Island from the Department of Conservation up to Dundee Street. So I'll just go through and skim through some points of the report. Hopefully you've all had a chance to read it. So the purpose: after the construction of the new Rakura Heritage Centre, the Community Board agreed with the Museum Trust to reconstruct the existing footpaths adjacent to the Heritage Centre and install curbing and footpath. The project was approved and is to be delivered under an existing minor works contract 2013. As an extension to this project, the Stewart Island Rakura Community Board now wish to continue the concrete footpath construction along Main Road from outside the dock, the Department of Conservation office, up to Dundee Street. So that would complete that section from the new museum right up to Dundee Street. So you've got the background there. Some issues. We did have a meeting with the project delivery team, the roading team and the Three Waters team to discuss some concerns, some drainage issues outside the dock office there, and we believe that we've got those under control with the design of the footpath that we intend to install there. So funding, the Community Board had originally got an estimate from a local contractor on Stewart Island to undertake this work, and subsequently applied to the Stewart Island Visitor Levy and were successful for the value of the quote that they got at the time. Upon the meeting with the Three Waters project delivery and roading team, there were a couple of things that were omitted from the original quote request, and so we went back to the original tenderer plus another 2 additional tenderers and sought repricing. The original tenderer actually declined to reprice the project, but we did receive 2 prices at 38 and 39,000 respectively. As the original request for Stewart Island Visitor Levy funding was only $31,000, that leaves a shortfall. So what this report seeks to request is actually a total project cost of potentially $41,800, which allows a 10% contingency over and above the quote which we would like to accept. I think I've got in there to have a nil contingency is not a sensible option, just in case there is anything that comes up that we are aware of whilst we're undertaking the project. So as I said, there would be a potential total project cost of 41,800, of which 10,800 would need to be funded from Stewart Island General Reserves. I've put in there obviously the reserves balance, including what is currently committed, and then I guess we head down to the options considered, which there's only two: to approve the project and the unbudgeted expenditure, or to not approve. So our recommendation is to proceed with option 1, to approve the project and the associated unbudgeted expenditure and continue with the project.
Thank you, Brendan. Any questions from council?
Well, I'm happy with the recommendation. It's just a question for me that when the initial quote was sought, is it an expected process that it comes through roading and reserves at the time, and was this missed, and how do community boards, if they're going out to do this work, know that that's an important component?
Through you, Your Worship, that is, I guess in our procurement policy, we do like to obviously have that process in place. I believe timing was a big part of how this eventuated, with the community board perhaps seeking a price outside that normal process. I think it was perhaps something that the roading team at the time couldn't commit to, because of the short time frame and the time frame with regards to having the Stewart Island levy application in. So I think it was something that was requested, something that obviously should have been followed, perhaps, but it wasn't in this case.
Well, I guess a community board is not going to sit down and read their way through the procurement policy, so, and obviously there was a timing issue here, so it may be how we can support that in the future, rather than, because we've got a delay now and obviously additional expense for the community boards, so
absolutely,
just making sure that we prevent that in the future, I guess.
Absolutely. Great question.
Through you, Your Worship. The key thing I think that Brendan was saying is that earlier that if the community board are looking for the project, the earlier they can engage with the staff, the better. Then we can look at what risks may be or what else is being considered in and around that area. So those things can be allowed. I think this was just really down to a matter of timing and trying to get into that the visitor levy funding. Typically we would have engaged in that project.
If I remember right, it started in December 2019, this project. Mr. Russell.
Thank you. Through you, Your Worship. Just in response to your comments, Councillor Menzies, absolutely right. The visitor levy is a process that is unique to the Stewart Island community and falls outside of our usual works program cycling, planning, LTP programming process, and perhaps we're dealing with a bit of a legacy issue. We've now, through this new triennium, established a process and working with the community board and identifying what and when those projects for visitor levy tagged for visitor levy funding need to be scoped and into that process, and also included those projects within the upcoming LTP. So moving forward, this issue is anticipated to be avoided.
Thank you.
Councillor Ford.
I'll just put my hand up. I cut the apple tree down because I filled the application on behalf of the board because it wasn't going fast enough in my opinion, and we wanted to get that visitor levy money, so Brendan's explained the rest. Certainly, localism has been applied.
However, it's still taken 12 months.
Yes, of course. I'm happy to move that.
Okay, so just before we do that, this gets ticked off today. It's unbudgeted expenditure. And then the opening's on the 1st of December. When is this work likely to be completed?
Through you, Your Worship, we have had discussions outside this meeting regarding, because there are two individual contractors, one being RDR Builders and the other being Duncan Earthworks and Excavation. We've actually had discussions with both parties and asked them to collaborate, and with the idea that the immediate section outside the museum would be focused on and get as far away from the museum, get as much of that project completed as they possibly can, if not finished, prior to the museum opening. The implication of that, Your Worship, is that another piece of work which Duncan Earthworks and Excavation were primed to start next week will have to be delayed. So that is a piece of work which, after this meeting, if this is approved, we will go back to the community board, have a discussion with them and get agreement on prioritisation so that we are all on the same page.
So that's another 2 or 3 weeks?
No.
Right. I'm just thinking that 1st of December it would be fantastic to have that area finished rather than walking around in a whole lot of mud. That's all I'm...
Absolutely. Yeah. I
would hate
agree,
for,
and we are working on it.
I would hate for the community board to be responsible for a whole lot of mud out the front. Yeah. Okay, so Councillor Ford has moved the recommendation. Before I put it, is there any further questions? Otherwise it's seconded by Councillor Menzies. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Go and start at the concrete mixer.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Okay, the next item on the agenda is 8.2, which again is unbudgeted expenditure for Don Street dark fibre connection. Thank you, Jock.
Good morning, Worship and councillors. Today I'm here to talk about Don Street dark fibre connection and its unbudgeted expense request. It's a little bit unusual because I'm actually looking for funding to be brought forward from future operational years into this existing year to cover the installation of what we call a dark fibre or private fibre that is owned by ICC. The reason this request has come about, as you've possibly read through this document, when we moved to our Don Street premises, we had two options available to us for networking back to our data centre here at 4th Street. Those two options are both fibre connection options, one being a shared business option and one being a fully dedicated option. We chose the shared option as the lowest price, and based on information we've previously used from our Winton site, which is also using a shared option and worked successfully there, we believe that was going to be the best option for Don Street sites. What we didn't anticipate going into Don Street was the number of people that are on that site and the type of work that was being done through that site. So, in investigation, initially we identified two options. The third option around dark fibre come through a conversation with our IT shared services group, just when we started talking about issues we were facing. So what I'm asking for here is, effectively, we have a budget, an operational budget. This work could have sat as an operational piece of work or a capital piece of work, but because it has a capital component to it, as in they have to go and dig up the street to blow the fibre down the duct that currently exists in Don Street, it was felt that it sat within the capital expenditure bucket, and we didn't have that sitting in our current budget. So this has got some reasonably technical details in it. Effectively what we've got is an unproductivity situation for some of our high intensity data applications like our geospatial data, so our mapping system and our document management system. And that's purely just the amount of documents and files transferring across effectively a business grade broadband connection or fibre connection. What this dark fibre offers on top of a Spark dedicated environment is a 10 times speed increase. So although Spark can provide the same type of solution, it's a lot more expensive, and although it will solve the problem, it's probably not the best long-term solution. Looking at the ROI, return on investment, for putting that dark fibre into both those sites, we believe there's a 3-year payback, and after that 3 years we'll be able to reduce our operational and networking costs for those 2 sites. So the option today, the proposal today is to adopt option 1, which is move forward with the dark fibre connection to both Don Street offices, and have that paid back over the next 3 years from our current operational networking budgets. This has no effect on rating. It just lives in because it lives in an operational budget, and we're asking for capital. I'm here today to explain it.
Okay, thank you. Any comments or questions, Councillor?
Well, that's not a field I know a lot about, but it makes perfect sense to me.
Awesome. Councillor Fraser.
There's no issues once, if we were to leave those premises, I guess the cable just lay on the ground and it's not an issue. We've got any latent responsibility to sort.
You're correct, Councillor. Because we control all of the equipment, we just disconnect the pieces we don't want. So, for example, if we moved out of 42 Don Street and only based ourselves at 20 Don Street, we can disconnect 40, no cost to us. We just pick up our own equipment and redeploy it to the next site we go to.
So the recommendation has got, indeed, says notes to the users at Don Street. Are we saying both 20 and 42?
Yes. But this cost covers giving fibre to both those sites.
Okay. All right. So Councillor Duffy, did you move that recommendation?
Yes.
So Councillor Duffy's moved the recommendation. Unless there's any other questions, is there a seconder? Councillor Fraser, all those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thank you
very much.
Next item on the agenda is the projects carried forward into the next financial year. Susan's going to present these, and you'll find them on page 297 of your agenda.
Thank you, Your Worship. Before I go into the report in a bit further detail, Ms Dunlop has brought up on screen the recommendations. We found as we were doing a final review and checks and reconciliations into some documents in the LTP that we have 2 numbers in the report that were incorrect, relating to some work around Stewart Island Opportunities project, and also in relation to some wellhead improvements and sealing off old wells. So in terms of the report in general, this is a report that we've been using every year to carry forward work that has not been completed in 2019-20, the last financial year, and bringing it into the current year so that we have a budget for people to be able to complete, for staff to complete the work as appropriate. In some cases, there will have been parts of these projects already in the 2021 annual plan, and in some cases they are in the years. These are projects and operating expenditure, the report is split into multiple categories, that the projects will be talked about through the annual plan and a report process as well as to what stage they're at and what's going on. In here we've included items of projects, and that's been in your attachment is based on by activity so that you can see each activity as a whole. We've got some operational expenditure, and we've got some other capital work, which is where a number of the roading program, particularly items such as the accelerated bridge program, have been included in. And in total, the amount that's been requested to carry forward in the current year with the adjustments that I was referring to at the beginning is $9,077,044. Most of, or a reasonable amount of that when you look at it, is tied up between the Tiana wastewater stem and moving that around, the accelerated bridge program for roading in particular, and a couple of, there's 2 water pipe replacements, here one in Matata and one in Tiana, that is reasonable dollars attached to them. At this stage, staff have indicated that this shouldn't cause any issues in relation to work being delivered during the year, particularly for the roading program. They acknowledge and
know that this is year 3 of their 3-year cycle, and so that this year they're looking to deliver all that work through.
Okay, Councillor Kramer.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just to clarify on that last point, because that was my concern as well, that we've got all these projects that we're carrying forward. What implications will that have on being able to deliver those projects and also the projects that have been planned for the following year? Do we have the resources to be able to ensure, with a condition being permitted, that all these projects will actually be implemented? Because otherwise you're going to carry it over the following year. We've been down that track for years and we're making some progress. I think we just sort of step back slightly, although there's a couple of big projects there. So just some reassurance that we will be able to achieve these projects and the projects that are planned for the following year.
Through you, Your Worship, perhaps I'm best to provide some context in response to your question, Councillor Kramer. As Susan articulated, there's a reasonably significant chunk of money tied up with a reasonably small number of projects that, from a timing perspective, I'm sure you can appreciate a lot of these projects are multi-year and don't necessarily neatly fit within a financial year. Te Anau wastewater, you'll be aware we had some consenting and budget delays last year, the last financial year, that have since been resolved, and we have, from a program perspective, managed to effectively get back on track. So there's a reasonable degree of confidence with Te Anau wastewater specifically. We've made some really positive progress with the Three Waters program, business as usual program I'm talking about, as opposed to the stimulus funding program, and we are a large proportion of the way through this year's water and waste program as it stands currently, only 4 months into the financial year. And the sealing program was the other significant chunk of change that was impacted by the inclement weather at the beginning of this calendar year that cut our sealing season reasonably short. And we're confident that we can, weather permitting, deliver on the overall committed 3-year program of works, in particular as a result of getting ahead from a rehabilitation perspective. In years 1 and 2 we over-delivered, so the accelerated bridge program, again that's more of a timing. A number of bridges straddled the 2 financial years, but well on track to be completed within this construction season. So whilst it's difficult at this stage of the financial year to say hand on heart we can deliver what we've set out to achieve, I'm confident we're in good stead to continue to deliver against our commitments without needing to, at this stage, revisit our resources and commitments. Is there anything further you'd like to add?
Through you, Your Worship, that's a very good summary where we're at the moment.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Councillor Duffy.
I just noticed there's a item under district and operational, a community awards night of $10,000.
Yeah.
We've always funded those in our own community areas.
I don't know why that's there either.
It was an intention through Your Worship that this lady was looking to develop a district from a district perspective rather than just the local. Right. So bringing the district component to extension to those local awards, it was more for the district awards.
Any other comments or questions on anything in regards to these matters?
Just,
Councillor Davis, sorry.
just a clarity one. So $9 million of carry forwards this year. How does that compare to the last 2 or 3 years?
So dollars wise, unfortunately don't have it last year's number on my head, but dollars wise this year it is larger. Particularly if I take Tiana wastewater out year on year. There is a report that will go through to the next finance and assurance meeting that also gives some of that comparison as well. One of the things about this year that is slightly different, as I say, in terms of dollars, is that this year, between what's occurred with the flooding in February and then COVID coming through with a lockdown on the back end of that, is that for the first time in a while the roading team actually has a significant amount of dollars to move through. So COVID had an impact for them on delivering those bridges and starting that work. So dollars wise it's significantly higher. Number of projects, and I did have the numbers in my head when I wrote it, but it's gone. My gut says that actually it's lower in terms of number of projects than in previous years. Dollars wise certainly much higher, but I can come back to you with that detail.
It's sort of around $5 million.
Yeah,
is the figure that I had in my head.
Correct, last year was just under 5 mil, so it was carried over. So. But as it's been pointed out, there's a couple of large components here that's adding to the project.
Okay, any other questions around this matter? All right, otherwise then thank you, and you have the recommendations A through to D with all of that list with those amendments under Stewart Island Opportunities Project, changed from 19,120 to 5,977, and under District Wellhead Improvements from 13,997 to 137,997, total of 9,077,024. Moved by Councillor Kramer, seconded by Councillor Douglas. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you very much. Next item on the agenda is 8.4, still under operation, page 311 of the agenda, the unbudgeted expenditure for community housing for business case. Kevin.
Thank you, Your Worship. As you said, this report is seeking approval for the scope for the preparation of the community housing business case and unbudgeted expenditure for the project. I have included in the report the historical information reports and the Morrison Lowe portion of the 17A review for all the councillors' benefit. And I'll take the report as read. In short, the statutory 17A review process is reasonably narrow in its focus. When that report was presented to council, it did suggest or did recommend or comment that a broader investigation needs to be undertaken before council made a final decision on where it saw this activity being in the future. Where we're at now is to try and go and ascertain through the business case a lot more detail, as we've set out in the scope around the list of issues that we've seen, that we've identified, to get more detail on all of those so we can come back to council with all the relevant information to allow council to make an informed decision on the future, whatever that might be. So I'll just leave it at that and answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions of Mr. McNaught or Mr. Russell? Councillor Owen, Councillor Ford.
I'm wondering if the outcome sought could be a little bit more, I guess, a bit more detailed and specific. So, for example, when we've previously had discussions around this, we've asked for some further work to be done right through on the spectrum, from community social housing all the way through to affordable housing, and that work hasn't been done. and we had asked for that work to be done before this, and that hasn't happened so far. So I think that we need to be a little bit more specific in terms of the detail that we've previously had discussions via email on what councillors would like, and I think that probably needs to be come through in some of this work. So for example, I think that when we're looking at what the demand is, I don't think we should limit it to just looking what's the demand for community housing. It needs to be right up to the scope of affordable housing, because I think there's going to be, when you're looking at potential solutions, there could be combinations. For example, there might be situations where there's just a shortage of rental housing that you could charge market rates for there, which could help subsidise some of the social housing, for example. So if we narrow the focus too much to just community housing right at the demand level, we could preclude some of those options evolving in the process. And I think we also need to be very clear that we want it on a community by community basis, not just a broad sweeping. Like, we need to understand what the issues are in each of the small communities within the district before making any decision as a whole on this area of activity.
Okay, through you, Your Worship, are you comfortable with me?
Absolutely. I was just going to ask Councillor Owen that maybe she needs to add, I agree with what she's saying, and maybe add something in D, or like in regards to the outcome sought, what they will be, so we can actually put them in here. So if you can have to think on
Your
that.
Worship, can I just question that? The piece of work that Councillor Owen was talking about, I was certainly instructed by the Chief Executive that it was not a priority for it to be undertaken. And I take exception that it has been raised that it has not been done. Because the instruction was, and actually the instruction also from the Mayor and the Deputy Mayor, was that it wasn't a priority for us to continue that work through.
Yes, I should have backed up the bus there, quite right, Mr. Capel.
And if we are, and the other factor with respect to that was, it was considered to be the work of South Housing Action Forum.
Yeah, exactly.
Not this council.
Yeah. I agree with Mr. Capel on what was said there, that the work wasn't carried out because of the information that was given by council. But is it an opportune time now to put it in? I think that's what we need to discuss. Is that where you want to go, Mr. Russell?
Yeah, thanks through you, Your Worship. I guess just a couple of comments in relation to scope. I think it's important to note that there are a number of broader conversations happening both regionally and nationally that sit alongside our current activity, potentially, that that effectively deem this work quite timely in terms of positioning us to understand our existing activity. So this work is predominantly prefaced on what our existing activity is. So whilst I recognise, Councillor Owen, there's the potential for the activity longer term to expand, particularly in the context of some of those other regional and national conversations. From the perspective of our current scope is around arming you, the councillors, with information around our existing activity and the need associated with our existing activity. So our existing activity is effectively started as pensioner housing and has merged slightly into the social housing arena without any explicit commitment from council that we undertake social housing. We are the activity started as pensioner housing. We see this as an opportunity to pause and reflect. What is the purpose of the activity, and what is the state of the activity, in particular around those items that we've identified in terms of demand in the context of the existing activity, the regulatory framework and environment in which we're operating, and our degree of compliance against that regulatory framework, the funding and affordability discussion around existing rents and revenue, how the activity is funded, the demand on on that revenue in terms of expenditure longer term, to meet that, I guess, increasing regulatory requirements, but also the asset management state of the asset perspective, and then what are the staff resources required, and lastly the 17A report identifies some of the context around the future ownership and whether council is best placed to provide that service, or whether there are other entities within the Southland context to provide that service in conjunction with us or separately to us, and an assessment of that as well.
Okay. I might ask the Chief Executive to comment.
Yes, thank you, Worship. So picking up the points that Mr. Russell's made in terms of the scope of this work and reflecting on Councillor Owen, your comments, I think for me maybe the best way to consider this is a two-phase project, kicking off this initial phase with the elements that Mr. Russell and Mr. McNaught have outlined, and then having regard to the wider issues which in part are going to be informed in terms of where the new government is heading and potentially what the scope of that might look like in terms of opportunities for local government, and consider that as part of a second phase at an appropriate point. And I'm mindful too that Mr. Capel and his team have a report coming to, I think, the strategy committee meeting next month, which looks at a broader picture in terms of the future direction and scope of local government, and having regard to that, I think splitting this work up into those two phases certainly makes sense from my point of view. So it's not that the work that has been suggested wouldn't be done, it's just when that might be done and in what context, having regard to a national policy direction, which I'm sure will be forthcoming sooner rather than later.
Thank you. On my list I had Councillor Fraser and Scott. Did you have a question? So Councillor Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Worship. Just to support what Councillor Owen was saying, I think it is really important that we look at this holistically for where it sort of fits in the needs of the district, and at the moment, like a bit of research that I've done indicates that this is actually fulfilling a need where there's people who don't have anywhere else to potentially go. So it's actually quite a strategic or important role. And I think also when you look at the way local government could be going with the three waters type thing, where our mandate's going to potentially go as well into that more sort of social kind of area. And just the other point or question I guess I've got is around that $50,000 and whether that's or what requires that amount of money, because to me $50,000 could go a long way to getting that average community housing up to good. When they were all listed as good, one average one, we could put that into that and actually get that up to standard as well. So just in value for money, there's a lot of information here already that sort of I've drawn up some figures myself just to try and work out where they all sit. And with that Morrison Low report, how far do we actually need to go with a $50,000 budget to actually pull everything together?
And that's something I had a question before I moved to Councillor Harper. Maybe we can talk about that $50,000 budget for this, unbudgeted expenditure of 50K. Surely we've got enough in-house information without going outside to get
Through
this.
you, Your Worship, unfortunately not. There's a fair bit of information and context gathering. There's also a resource issue. We've got a property team of 2.5, and they're simply stretched. The demands on the team are growing. There's been significant work underway in addition to this around getting our heads around as an organisation. There's 2,500 different properties we've got, and a signal from council that they're wanting to prioritise review of that portfolio of properties and looking to opportunities to divest, and it's simply a resource, and issue and a prioritisation issue at this stage.
Okay, in regards to the resource issue, we've certainly said to the previous ELT and Chief Executive if there's an issue with resource, ask for it. So to get some of this work done, I agree with Councillor Scott and some comments I read in the media that the 50k would be better spent in the buildings, but I hear where you're coming from, Mr. Russell. I just, as somebody that used to work in that department, we have got a considerable amount of information already on hand, and we've got the Morrison Low report, so something we could discuss later. Councillor Harper.
Yes, Your Worship. I'd just like to back up some of Councillor Owen's comments there about the community housing. They do need to be set out as individual lots, I believe, and I do believe strongly, and along with some of your comments, Your Worship, that the locals have a better idea and understanding of who they have and what needs to go in those accommodation departments. The other comment I will make, that Councillor Owen mentioned, was the reference to our past Chief Executive Officer. Started off talking about the pensioner housing and the importance of divesting of them, and made reference to divest them, and then when we were brought up later on in the meeting, or the next day I think, it was swept under the table. So, and this is twice to my knowledge that divesting of our pensioner housing has been discussed, and nothing further has happened. So I would strongly suggest that we get a workshop together one day and have a wee talk about it and get the issue out of the hands and not do what we're doing here over again.
So that's where the Morrison Low, correct me if I'm wrong, identified that there's better ways of doing it, or other ways of doing this, I should say better ways, and one of those is possibly divesting. So to say it was swept under the table, I don't know if that's correct. But we do need to get a picture of where we're at and where we intend to go, and then talk about the workshop.
Unless we start finishing projects, we're going to be doing this for the next 50 years.
Okay, Councillor Kramer.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just to reiterate previous comments with regards to the decision not to proceed with this particular project some time ago, that information was relayed back to councils by our Chief Executive, and it was because we were looking at the regional and national housing issues, so we were going to link into that. So that information was brought back here. I concur with Councillor Owens that we do need to look at the bigger picture, but also pick up on your comments, Ross, that there are probably two components to this. And the other thing I want to comment on is that I cannot believe that we've got to spend 50k trying to work out what we don't know when we've been looking at this for so many years. And surely to goodness we have enough information to make some decisions, quite honestly. As Councillor Harper has indicated, we've talked about this, and I can see we've got a reserve of over $100,000 sitting there, and yet we can't maintain some of our facilities. So it's a bit disturbing to have this sort of report come to this table. I do shake my head that we should have this information. We've had these assets for quite some time, and we should know exactly where our assets look like. We should know when the demand is for those assets. We should have that.
Through you, Your Worship, I'll just make a comment that absolutely we've got asset management information, and I can assure you we meet our legislative and regulatory requirements, although there's indications that those are changing in the very near future, and the importance of assessing our existing asset base against that regulatory framework is extremely important. Assessing the purpose of the activity, the demand for the activity, the regulatory environment, the funding and affordability modelling, and the potential future ownership and operating models simply falls outside of the brief of the existing mandate for the property team as it currently sits in the resource within that team.
That's enough.
I can't stress that enough.
Can I add, if I may, Your Worship, that my understanding is through this report we're looking for approval for a budget up to a maximum amount. That's not what will be spent, and based on what I'm hearing, probably won't be spent. And if part of the procurement process to engage for the delivery of this work means that we're able to provide some information that we hold already for those intending to bid on the work, and that reduces the cost, then I would expect that to be reflected in the prices that we get back for the work to be undertaken.
Okay, thank you. I hear Councillor Byers and then Ford, is that right?
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, I'm referring to Morrison Low. Community housing contributes to a healthy community. I'm pleased to hear that there's concerns over spending $50,000 for a report into what we've already got. But I note the Timaru Council has 232 houses that are social housing up there, and there's no cost to their ratepayer. I wonder if rather than doing a report, we see if someone would come down from Timaru and talk to us about what they do.
There's no cost to our ratepayers either, other than a bit of some staff time.
Well, you probably for $1,000 you might get someone down there they're running a successful operation up there. We might learn something from them.
Okay, Councillor Ford.
Yes, I relate some of the other speakers' comments, and I resent spending 50k on what another report. Morrison Low report's only 2 years old, and it's got some salient bits in there. It's a pretty important process that we have housing available, and it's well known countrywide. We should not be slipping our responsibilities really to do better. And I think it's a management thing that requires a bit more attention. If we need more rent, well, there are various welfare agencies that will provide money into the rental system. There's rent-related income, which just requires someone to manage and back to social welfare for that. So there are ways of doing that, and certainly Southland is no different to the rest of the country. We need people in houses, and those people haven't got houses. So it needs more attention. I don't believe we should spend 50k. And certainly if you go to Dunedin, they've got 1,000 community houses in their portfolio. So they're doing something that works, as many other councils.
I don't think we're not saying ours doesn't work. Yeah. It's just
We'll do it better.
Councillor Scott.
Just thinking of all the conversations that we're having right now, is it worth, before we go any further on this, actually having a workshop about it and utilising some of the knowledge we've actually got in the room as well, that we don't, so we're not going out and paying for something that we've potentially already got, and if we actually sit down and have a bit of a session on it.
I was just discussing with Fiona whether we leave this on the table or we make some other recommendations.
Your Worship?
Councillor Kramer.
Maybe we reduce the 50 down to 30.
Yeah, well, before
if you don't want to spend 50, are you prepared to spend 20, 30, or nothing?
And who are we going to spend it on?
Yeah, you need to know what you're spending it on.
Sure.
Like, you can't just take a number out of the sky. We've got to actually be buying something.
So through you, Your Worship, is back to the report and the scope of the business case. This scope is in direct response to instruction from Council to undertake the work to establish the broader context to provide you the information you're looking for, based on the 17A report that was presented in February 2018. I'm not sure what I'm...
No, I'm hearing that, but things have moved on a little bit with in relation to what has been required from central government as well, hence why the work was stopped, and the housing team were doing some of this stuff, etc., etc., etc. So it was a mishmash of information at the time, to be fair.
Yes, sorry, through Your Worship, perhaps I need to articulate myself better. Is it the scope of the report that you have an issue with, or is it the resource required to scope, to provide the information that you have an issue with?
Well, I think the scope's possibly changed, and that's where the idea of having a workshop as to what we do require now may be different than it was a couple of years ago. I'm just picking that up. So maybe Councillor Scott.
Yeah, I mean, just to answer your question from my perspective as well, is when we requested that, I wasn't aware of that Morrison Law report, and having that information here, I mean, I've done up a spreadsheet of working out where the current position is. There's enough information there for me to almost make a decision in what we've got here, with a little bit more sort of what Councillor Owen was talking about, wider context in there, but I think we're kind of halfway there already. And that's why I think there'd be value in a workshop.
Okay, Councillor Owen, Councillor Duffy.
Yeah, just thinking the other major thing that's changed in that time is also in response to COVID and the emergency housing that was provided, and I'm not sure exactly what the long-term solution was to those people post-lockdown as well. So that is a big question mark for me in that space, that really informs a lot of this discussion. That I would like to have clarity on some of that background stuff first, to really make sure that if we're going to spend 50k on a report, that it gives us enough information to make some well-informed decisions. So I think some more workshopping on the actual scope of the report would be really valuable.
Councillor Duffy.
I was just going to say, Mr. Russell's right in what he says. It was us that asked for it originally. But of course, I mean, in our area now, housing is very, very tight. There's just cannot get rental accommodation now. So I think perhaps the need has sort of changed a bit. And me, likewise, I don't want to see 50,000 spent if we don't have to. But we do need to put to bed this conjecture about whether we should be doing it or whether we shouldn't. And if we're going to be doing it, you know, we need to lift the standard and that sort of thing. So I would like to think that we can inform ourselves of that, if we, you know, with what information we've got, and by keeping our feelers out. I was certainly given some clear guidelines by our community board chair of what she thought about this prospect, and I've got certainly some sympathy for that.
Okay, I'm feeling that we need to leave this on the table, Mr. Chief Executive, and have a workshop in the very, very near future, and have everybody's views, opinions expressed during that workshop as representatives of the communities that do have this luxury of having community housing.
Good idea, Rob.
We won't have opportunity before Christmas. I'd like to say that we do before our last meeting, maybe of council.
Yeah, sure.
So let's make a target for that if we can, and well aware of the resources involved in doing it.
So through you, Your Worship, just in response to that, we had targeted getting this work underway sooner rather than later in a bid to inform the upcoming LTP, just so you're aware. By leaving it on the table, we'll miss that deadline, and that's just some information.
Thank you.
You need to
So I move that we leave it on the table. Is there a second? Second, Councillor Harper. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you. Okay, so the next item on the agenda is a monthly financial report, page 329 of your agenda.
Your Worship and Councillors, just like you to take the monthly financial report as read, and I'll just highlight a couple of points. Just to note that the phasing of the budgets, so the spreading of the costs in the months that they will occur, hadn't taken place before the end of August when these figures were pulled together. Operating income, in September, it'll be done in September. Operating income is 1.1 million under the projected for the 2 months, and a portion of that relates to the wastewater in Tianel, the project where we took forward some income in June as reported then, just to do with the MVIE grants. and that project is on track to be completed by the end of the year and the full grant income fixed up by then, or captured, should I say. The expenditure is where we see most of the variances around those phasing issues. So there's not too many variances related to actual costs. One to note is, of course, the governance is below budget due to current vacancies. So the staff costs are a little bit lower than anticipated there. Just on the capital expenditure, that is 2.6 million under projection, and as we've talked about, a lot of that is around roading district-wide, where the timing of the work is more October to March, so phasing will correct that. The street works is over budget by 229,000, and that relates back to those carry forwards that was presented to you just prior to this. So that's a timing issue from last year to this year, and that project has now been completed. The wastewater in Te Anau, as talked about, the expenses haven't been spread through, and that is under budget by just short of $1 million, just from the timing of that. And just to note that the statement of financial position, the June comparative, is the pre-audit statement of financial position of where we were then, and it was the same numbers as presented to Finance and Audit Committee that the auditors are currently reviewing.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? You did well.
Didn't feel like I did.
They're still awake. All right. Any comments or questions in regards to the financial report? Abel hasn't got his hand up, so we're all good. Okay, the recommendation is that we receive this report. Councillor Kramer, seconded Councillor Fraser. All those in favour? Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is our management report from our Chief Executive, Ross McNeil. Welcome, Ross.
Yes, thank you, Worship. So perhaps in the interest of time, I'll take the report as read, and there are a number of staff around the room who are able to answer any questions, but there are one or two things, if I may, just to highlight. So picking up the point earlier in terms of the Rakiura Museum, so work is proceeding in terms of the displays and getting the inside of the facility ready for the opening in early December, and picking up the desire from the council that the external environment is given some consideration as well, and I know staff are aware of that. The predator-free Rakiura project, I understand there was a public announcement regarding the funding that's been made available. I believe that was $5 million.
Probably to start with, and another further 5 after that.
Yes, very good.
In relation to both building solutions and later on in the report resource management, I'm acutely aware that this council had concerns about the delivery of those activities and made provision for funding. So we are well advanced with the recruitment of staff in those areas. Noting regarding the Community Partnership Fund and the, I don't have a reference point, but 88 applications seems to me to be a process that's been reflects a process that's been well communicated and subsequently engaged in terms of those applications and noting that the process is well advanced for those allocation decisions to be made. Noting that under the Milford Opportunities project, there is an additional project or program within the overall project that's being advanced. It's sitting within the overall budget for the project and utilising, which of course is externally funded, and utilising the contingency part of that. I note there is a separate paper to the Community and Strategy Committee meeting on that matter in November. And perhaps I'll leave it there, and if there are specific questions, they can be answered either myself or perhaps more specifically by the group manager or manager of the area responsible.
Thank you. Any questions? Councillor Menzies.
Thank you, Bishop. Just under paragraph 26 with the resource consent data for the last few months, there's more decisions being issued than applications received, but that doesn't tell us what the picture is in there, but that's I just wondered if there was where that wait time sits or if that's improved overall.
I see Fran's not here, so happy to provide that. And obviously there's a timing issue that it's probably rare for decisions to be made in the same month that applications are received, depending on the nature of the application.
Yes, hence the question about where that actually sits.
Councillor Duffy.
Just on that, we used to get a sort of a regular report on the number of applications at the same time last year, and those sorts of comparisons that included that. It was just a simple sort of a graph. That hasn't happened lately, and perhaps that might be something that could be reinstated.
Yeah, actually I haven't seen one for a while.
No, I haven't either. I don't know.
All right, we'll make sure that returns as a feature, because I know that information is being tracked, so and I'm aware of some of it. So
we used to get it for both building and resource management.
Right.
Yeah. Just another point. I noticed with the Community Partnership Fund that council-owned halls, their committees, if you like, aren't able to apply because it's a council-owned facility. And I think that's a wee bit tough, because even though it's council-owned, council, apart from collecting the rate and giving it over to pay their bills, we don't actually contribute funding to it as such. So those groups are fundraising themselves, and I think that sort of hampers them unnecessarily. And I mean, I don't know how you get round it, but it's just that's how I see it.
I know there was an application through the Collett Bay one, wasn't there, Councillor Owen, that was along the same lines.
We had one or two, we don't know how many it was.
It's just,
so I don't know whether that's because of law or what, but it's not a good result.
Depends on what the funding's for, like a new roof or something. I don't think that would be appropriate.
Your Worship, I think the boards were talking about, when they set their criteria, they were talking about the fact that where activities or projects were locally funded, they would be locally funded. The Community Partnership Fund is derived by district funding, and that was the point of differentiation that the local community boards, from the brief that I've had from the community liaison officers, was that I've asked the community liaison officers to revisit it for the next rounds and see where that sits, but it comes down to a locally funded activity being funded by district, through the back door, a district funded fund.
Right.
So that's the conversation that I've asked them to go away and unravel and then try and get back together.
Okay, so it's already been identified by the sound of it.
Okay.
Thank you. Councillor Menzies, Councillor Scott.
Thank you, Worship. Just with regard to paragraph 36 around the observation rock application to the Provincial Growth Fund, which I understand may not be available in the future, the fund will stop. Is there another meeting to consider that fund, or because the application was not received in time, that's actually the end of that opportunity?
Your Worship, the fund was made on, the application was made on behalf of the Department of Conservation, and working with the MB staff member, it was by the time that that application got through the election, the intervening cycle of the election got in the road of the process. So I'm assuming, don't know the facts, but I'm assuming, depending on whether that fund is still available and this new government will determine when it gets back on the table. And if the fund is not is discontinued, then obviously we would be ensuring that we would understand what other funds that may be derived or developed to replace a PTF fund would be considered as part of that, and we'd be working alongside DOC to do that.
Right, yes, I've just the understanding that we are prior to the election. I just wondered if there was still one more opportunity before
I'll
that's
have to
not.
follow that up, and I'll back it up. I'll get Karen or someone to talk to Mr. Patterson, who's the MD rep that stage she's been working with on that, and we'll come back to you.
Yes, and what other options might be available, as you say, for funding for that.
Councillor Scott.
What Councillor Menzies said, that's exactly what I was going to bring up.
I was going to interrupt, so but there is 90k allocated to that project from this levy currently. It's waiting for complication and price.
Thank you. Councillor Case.
Just like to point out that the figures that we would, or the information you're talking about for the resource management, and that does come through to the regulatory consents meeting. It's in that.
But it used to come to council.
Yeah, but it's in that. It's in this year.
Yeah.
But it is there.
Thank you. Councillor.
Just a question, I'm not sure if you can answer it now, is with regard to the MB funding for the Freedom Camping Ambassadors, is that going to other areas? I understand there's going to be two based in Te Anau, one in the Catlins. Are they going to cover a broader area, or is it just those areas?
I think Mr. Safidi's, the two in Te Anau are going to come down towards the Lumsden patch. Rob, have you had any discussion?
I haven't had any confirmation on that either.
Yeah, we'd have to
be able to
define that.
communicate with the community boards if someone's going to be covering those areas. Previously we've had no compliance or anything there.
So Mr. Safadi might be able to assist with that.
Yeah. The Catlins one comes over as far as that Waituna Lagoon, I understand, and then that's as far this way as it comes.
Yeah, Fort Rose and then Waituna, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, are there any other questions of...
Just another thing which we sort of alluded to in here, that fund that the government had for halls and war memorials that we didn't apply to, is that over now? Because I think we dropped the ball there with that one.
So I have asked that question. Louise, you're shaking your head.
Through you, Your Worship, I believe it was a one-off fund.
That was my
And
understanding.
it was very short-winded.
Yeah, well, we need to be more onto it with that. I don't know how we managed to miss there.
Councillor Kramer's onto that one.
Yeah, following on that session we had the other week, and this was raised, I've subsequently had talked to staff and asked them how we can get that information to us on a regular basis. And I think that was a suggestion that we have some sort of roll-on information on a regular basis, and we can identify quite clearly what's available and what's not available. I'll still have to have another discussion with some of the staff so that we can finalise that, and then we'll have that information on a regular basis so we can see what we can apply.
It'd be fair to say that quite a large number of buckets of money have come available over the last 3 or 4 months, and we haven't been able to keep an eye on them all. So some of them being watched by Great South, some of them by...
No, that one that was reported to us, it said that we didn't have the information, that we had it all the time.
Yes.
Yeah. That's what I found really disappointing about that.
Yeah, I'll follow that up.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions around the management report? Councillor Menzies.
So just in regard to paragraph 69, the comment around currently no market for low-grade plastics and limited markets for fibre. And just to note, there's a number of councils across the country now opting to discontinue their collection. Is that collection of those two elements or recycling altogether?
My understanding, there may be staff that can back this up or have a different view, but my understanding some councils are opting not to collect those elements.
Yes, yes. So the recycling is still occurring, but those...
Yes, not those two elements.
Yeah.
Through Your Worship, obviously one of our community partnership leaders is watching the meeting on live, because I've had a response already to your request, Councillor Menzies. Karen is meeting with Mark Patterson from me tomorrow in Christchurch with respect to the observation project.
Right, thank
We'll
you.
come back for you.
Through you, Your Worship,
Technology.
in relation to Councillor Menzies' question regarding recycling, our recycling product specification has not really changed through the transition to the renewed contract with Invercargill City Council, where we are one of the we are able to continue to offload the product we have been collecting to date at this point.
So that's important to note for our ratepayers, that they're still able to be collected. Thank you.
Councillor Duffy.
Well, I think people are very confused now about what they put in, and we need to update it. I don't know myself.
And if I can, Your Worship, just on that matter, my understanding is prior to the election, the previous government had been working on a national level of service standard for the country. So what happens to that work now, I'm not sure, but there was certainly a move to standardise what was being collected across the country to avoid that issue of confusion, and to take, I guess, from a leadership point of view, take a greater responsibility as a country for dealing with some of these things where that hadn't been the case in the past.
Okay, there being no further questions, I'm happy to move the management report. Is there a seconder, please? Councillor Scott, all those in favour?
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thank you for that, Ross. Last item on the agenda is and we'll just keep going before lunch, so coming back, is 9.1, the schedule of meetings for the 2021 up to the 8th of October 2022. A hard case that we're looking that far ahead, but that's where we're at. So it's Fiona's report, so Fiona.
Okay, the purpose of the report is to approve the meeting schedule up to the 8th of October 2022, which is actually election day for the end of this triennium. We've taken the approach to plan the rest of the triennium out to help you folk get the staff sorted out, a bit of forward planning. Community boards have set their schedules out to the end of the triennium as well. So yes, this schedule sets the dates for Council Services and Assets Committee, Community and Strategy Committee, Regulatory and Consents, Finance and Assurance Committee, Finance and Assurance Committee. It also points out where we've got council meetings where the draft LTP will be approved for consultation, deliberations, then finally approved, annual reports, annual plans. So yeah, that's it.
So just to touch on some concerns in the past, so these are the workshop dates will come on top of these if there's any workshops?
Yep. As long as people tell me what workshops are coming forward,
Yep.
Everything will work to plan.
Just aware that councillors have other lives as well, so this
Yep.
is great to get this out there.
Do we?
That was once upon a time.
Councillor Kramer.
Thank you. So confirmation these don't clash with the community board meeting?
Far as I know, they don't, but we can easily rejig things for community board meetings if that does happen.
And the other question is that I see that in March we have 3 days in a row. We have suggested in the past that we only have 2 days in a row, noting that we have other lives.
So is that the 23rd, 24th and 25th?
23rd, 24th, 25th.
So the 24th is a Regulatory and Consents Committee, but it may make more sense for the Finance and Assurance Committee to be the 24th and the Regulatory and Consents to be the 25th, given that you're already down rather than travelling 2 days. Yeah. And I think there was another one of those in August or sometime, wasn't it?
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, well, that's the stuff we can do. We can turn that round.
Yeah.
Do that now.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that would go for anything like that, Councillor Kramer, wouldn't it? Where there's something.
Is it August 24th, 25th, 26th?
No, March 24th and 25th.
Yeah, but there was another one as well. But if you look, it's just
Yeah, was it August?
As well, March.
Yeah, 24.
Yeah.
24.
Okay, we'll move those two down.
Okay.
Still have something to go through the through.
Yeah.
So,
It does save on a travel for.
well, it doesn't just travel, it's like you're staying here, you're here for 3-4
Yeah.
days.
Yeah.
Takes
And
3
all
days out of your own
2022 is,
business. And we've said in the past that we will try and not have 3 days in a row, but a maximum of 2 days in a row.
No, that's cool. We can look at those.
In fact, one of the reasons the finance and assurance was looked at because some of those meetings were straight after council and there wasn't, and some of those matters need to come before council rather than after, wasn't it?
Still adopt it.
Yeah, yep.
Okay, so we can still adopt this diary, or this series schedule of
Change
meetings
the,
and change those focuses on those ones. Yep.
yeah, the order of the meetings around.
Are there any other comments about this? If not, is there with the recommendations A through to D with those amendments as listed? I'm happy to move that. Is there a seconder?
Yeah. Can I ask one question for you, Luke?
Before I
The
pull it.
servers and assets, you've got 3 out here, I'm not sure when that's going to be long enough in the future either, considering some of the issues we've got coming. So you've got short meetings, which is then in conflict with community strategy coming straight after that, so you don't finish in time.
If the worst comes to the worst in that case, you open and adjourn the Community and Strategy Committee to reconvene at the end of the Services and Assets Committee, or adjourn the Services and Assets Committee to reconvene at the end of Community and Strategy Committee.
Or if there's not a lot on one agenda and a heap in the other, then cancel
We
it.
can rejig accordingly.
Okay, so I've moved it, seconded by Councillor Harper. All those in favour? Against? Carried. Thank you. That is the council meeting. I'm just going to ask everyone to stay back, other than the media, just for a very, very short workshop before lunch. No, very short workshop.